9th of April 2021 at Windsor Castle, Prince Philip died in his sleep. He was 99 years old. The palace announcement, released at noon, was 5 sentences long. It described him as His Royal Highness. It thanked the medical team, asked for privacy in a period of grief. By evening, every television channel in Britain was running archive footage and obituaries that had been and waiting in drawers for years. The version released to the public that week was a particular version, carefully assembled over decades of managed information, confirmed in the silence that followed every rumor, authorized by the sheer weight of institutional repetition. The dashing young naval officer from a displaced Greek royal family who had married future Queen of Britain in November 1947. The consort who had walked 2 steps behind her in public for 73 years. Man who had given up his own royal title, his own naval career, his own nationality, made himself useful in a role that Britain had never quite defined and never quite valued. The patriarch, the plain speaker, the husband. Version is not wrong, it is just incomplete. There was another version, known to the people who had actually lived alongside him. Senior officers of Buckingham Palace, the staff who worked through 4 decades of morning briefings and state dinners and household crises that never appeared in the court circular. The men who had drunk with him at the Thursday Club, in a private room above Wheeler's Fish Restaurant in Soho, through the 1950s. The women whose names circulated in London society for 50 years, sometimes in gossip columns, sometimes in biographies that arrived with careful legal qualifications attached, sometimes only as whispers at the kind of dinner party where everyone present already knows what you mean. His name and those women's names. Pat Kirkwood, and the October night in 1948, when Princess Elizabeth was 8 months pregnant with their first son. Hélène Cordet and the 2 children Philip educated and stood godfather to. The silence she maintained on the question of their father until she died. Sacha Abercorn and the carriage drives through Northern Ireland that his biographers noted with studied casualness. Susan Barrantes, former husband, once wrote in his own memoir that Philip had always made a beeline for the prettiest girl in the room, and Penny Knatchbull, who would eventually be described by Philip's own biographer as the second most important woman in his life, who was among the 30 people permitted to attend his funeral, sitting at careful distance in a black coat and a black hat while the Queen sat alone on the other side of the aisle. 5 women, 5 names, 5 different ways of understanding the same man. Official version of Prince Philip described a marriage that was the great love story of the 20th century British monarchy. 73 years together, the longest royal marriage in recorded history. Bond forged in wartime youth and tested across 7 decades of public pressure, family crisis, political change, particular difficulty of being 2 people who loved each other and who had been required by the structure of their lives to make that love work inside a gold cage. The Crown, which ran for 6 seasons on Netflix, turned the private architecture of that marriage into primetime entertainment and brought a new generation of viewers to the image of Philip as a perpetually at war with himself, brilliant but blocked, ambitious but constrained, faithful but only barely. Real Philip was more complicated than the screen Philip, and considerably harder to reduce to a single dramatic reading. He was consistent testimony of the people who knew him best, a man capable of great warmth and capable of great coldness, sometimes within the same afternoon. He had a mind that ran fast and impatience that ran faster, talent for cutting observation that made him magnetic company and frequently uncomfortable company at the same table. He was funny in the way that people with real wit are funny, without warning and without mercy, including toward himself on the occasions when he bothered to direct it inward. He was also capable of cruelty, calculated cruelty of a man who plans damage, but the offhand cruelty of a man who moves through the world at speed and does not always stop to notice what he has knocked over. The women in his life understood this about him, each in her own way, her own particular experience of what it meant. His mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, understood it from the beginning. She had given birth to him in Corfu in 1921, and then, through a combination of illness and terrible circumstance, been removed from his life when he was 8 years old. She would not see him properly for the next 5 years. She returned to his life as a woman in a grey nun's habit, who had founded a small religious order in Athens, having survived the Nazi occupation by hiding a Jewish family in her apartment at personal risk to her life. She came to live at Buckingham Palace in 1967. In the last 2 years of her life, She and Philip had accumulated between them a relationship of profound mutual love that neither of them had ever learned the language to properly express. Before we continue, a small request. If this kind of history interests you, the real texture of lives lived inside the palace structure, stories that operated in the gaps between the official statements and the authorized biographies, please subscribe to this channel. Click the bell icon. We release new documentaries on the people the palace treated as secondary, and what we consistently find is that the secondary characters understood more about the main story than anyone in it wanted to admit. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and then stay with us. The Philip who emerges over the next 2.5 hours is not the one you have been given. Hélène Cordet understood it from childhood. She had known him in Paris when he was a displaced boy living on the charity of his European relatives. Before the naval uniform, before the palace, before the public image had formed around him like a carapace, she had watched him become something that bore very little resemblance to the boy she had grown up with. She had maintained a silence about the nature of their adult relationship for the rest of her life. Pat Kirkwood understood it from one evening, one October night in 1948, when a mutual acquaintance brought Philip to her dressing room at the London Hippodrome, and what followed, dinner at Les Ambassadeurs in Mayfair, the dancing until dawn at the Milroy nightclub, the scrambled eggs somewhere after that, had detached his name to hers in the public consciousness for the rest of her life and for the rest of his. She spent the next 59 years asking him to clear her name. He declined. Sacha Abercorn and Susan Barrantes and Penny Knatchbull understood it in the ways that women understand men they have spent real time with, from a single public encounter or a single dramatic episode, but from the accumulated texture of years of conversation and shared activity and particular intimacy that comes from choosing, again and again, to be in the same room. This is the story those women saw. The story the palace released in April 2021. The story that lived in the silences of the official version, gaps between the authorized biography and the whispered one, in the letters that sat in a dead woman's estate waiting to be handed to a biographer who had not yet been chosen. Philip did not leave a memoir. He gave no deathbed interview. He had spent 73 years protecting the institution from his own contradictions, and in death as in life, institution's interests came first. But the women knew. Some of them talked carefully at measured distance, through biographers and journalists and the particular grammar of the not quite denial. Some of them said nothing at all, in its own way said everything. And one of them, the one who had spent the most years sitting in the same room with him, to his funeral and sat 10 feet from his widow and said nothing to the press on the way in or the way out. Before we go further into this story, you have been finding this kind of deep royal history worth your time. Take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel. Every week we go into the lives behind the official portraits, the people the palace preferred to keep in the background. New documentaries every week. Hit subscribe now, and hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next. Story of what Philip was like behind closed doors is not in the end. Story about infidelity or scandal or the gap between public performance and private behavior, although all of those things are present in it, is a story about what happens to a person when the first real losses of their life arrive before they have the tools to process them, how those early losses shape every relationship that comes afterward. Is a story about a man who learned very early to need nothing from the people around him, or at least to behave as though he needed nothing. What that training cost the women who loved him. To understand it, you have to start at the beginning. Not at the wedding in Westminster Abbey in November 1947, not at the Thursday Club in the early 1950s, even at the Dartmouth Royal Naval College in July 1939, when a 13-year-old Princess Elizabeth watched an 18-year-old naval cadet jump tennis nets and first fell in love with the man she would marry 8 years later. You have to start in Paris, in the mid-1920s, boy who had lost everything his family was supposed to provide, and who was learning, in the way that children learn the most important things, out understanding what he was learning, that the way to survive in the absence of reliable love was to make himself the kind of person other people wanted to look after. He had been 4 years old when Greece fell apart around him, not metaphorically. His father, Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, was arrested by the new Greek Republican government in November 1922, court-martialed, found guilty of military failure and sentenced to exile. The family fled the country on a British naval ship. The infant Philip, child and only son, was carried on board in a makeshift cot improvised from an orange crate. became one of the defining images of his origin story, and the reason it became defining is that it captured something true about the terms on he had entered the world, technically royal, practically dependent on the mercy of others, born a prince with no country to match the title. Family landed in Paris without money, without security, and with the particular burden of displaced European royalty, which is the requirement to maintain the appearance of being fine while not being fine at all. Philip's father, Prince Andrew, was charming, social, terribly decorated, and constitutionally unsuited to the patient work of domesticity or financial management. His mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, was deaf from birth, which she had compensated for so thoroughly across a life of determined self-sufficiency that most people who did not know her well did not realize it. She was also, by most accounts, more intelligent and more emotionally present of the two parents. She was also approaching the edge of something that would break the family apart. These were the years in which Philip ran loose in the streets of Paris with a girl named Hélène Foufouni, who would later become Hélène Cordet, who would later become one of the names attached to his. She was 3 years older than him. Her family were wealthy Greek merchants who had been friends of Philip's parents before the exile. They had landed in Paris at roughly the same time. In the same condition of elegant impoverishment, two children spent summers together at her family's villa in Le Touquet. They spoke Greek and French. They were, by every surviving account, genuinely close in the uncomplicated way that children are close when they are the right age and thrown together by circumstance and have no particular reason not to be. Neither of them knew in those Paris years what was about to happen to his family. Palace at the time of Philip's death in April 2021 was, in certain specific ways, a different institution from the one he had entered in 1947. It had become more transparent under pressure, more responsive to public criticism, more managed by communications professionals who understood the media landscape in ways that Philip's household staff of the 1950s had not needed to. Diana crisis had changed the equation. Andrew's Epstein entanglement had forced a further recalibration. Yet the basic architecture of palace information management had remained in its essential form, what it had always been: a set of institutional habits designed to absorb inconvenient facts and release selected truths in controlled circumstances. Philip had lived inside that architecture for 73 years. He had been, in some ways, its primary subject. His name had generated more managed silences than anyone else in the family during the post-war decades, because he was uniquely scandalous by the standards of the world he moved in, a world that included men like David Niven and Peter Ustinov, and a circle of well-connected Soho figures who lunched together at Wheeler's Fish Restaurant every Thursday through the 1950s. But because his marriage made every rumor into a constitutional question, an infidelity whisper attached to an ordinary politician is a political story. Same whisper attached to the husband of a reigning monarch becomes a question about the stability of the institution itself. Palace understood this from the beginning. Philip understood it too, though his understanding expressed itself differently from the palace's. Palace managed information, Philip managed access. He controlled what people saw of him through the sheer force of his personality, his speed of movement, his talent for making himself the person asking the questions rather than the person answering them. Staff who worked with him for years said consistently that the experience of his attention was disorienting. He was genuinely interested in people, genuinely curious, and the combination of that curiosity with his institutional power created a kind of asymmetry that made it difficult for the people he spoke to maintain their own perspective. You told him more than you intended to. You found yourself performing for him. You went home afterward and remembered the conversation with a slight bewilderment at how it had unfolded. This quality, reported again and again by the people who encountered him in professional settings, reported even more insistently by the women who knew him in personal ones. Something about Philip's attention, it was fully directed at a woman he found interesting, operated differently from the ordinary social attention of a wealthy and powerful man. He was not flattering in the conventional sense. He did not manufacture warmth. He was, if anything, more likely to be abrasive than attentive in mixed company, more likely to push back on what someone said than to agree with it. There was a quality in his specific interest when it arrived that the women who experienced it consistently described in terms that suggested, unlike what they had encountered from other men. Hélène Cordet described it obliquely in her 1961 memoir. Penny Knatchbull never described it directly at all. but the texture of their documented friendship across 4 decades makes the point by other. Pat Kirkwood described it in the most direct terms of any of them. Fury of the letters she wrote to his biographers, and occasionally to him directly. Pat Kirkwood was the one woman in his orbit who did not think the terms of engagement had been fair, and who was not willing to accept silence, price of his company. The Dartmouth meeting in 1939, which produced what would become the most photographed marriage of the 20th century, in Britain was observed by Philip's cousin Alexandra, who wrote about it later. Alexandra's account describes a girl of 13 so charmed by a naval cadet of 18 that the people watching them could not quite credit what they were seeing. Philip, in her account, was performing for Elizabeth, running the breadth of the tennis court, eating all the shrimps, creating around himself the exact impression that a young man creates when he has decided he wants to be noticed by a specific person. He had the gift that many people with difficult childhoods acquire, of being able to present exactly what the situation requires. At 13, alone on a tennis court at a naval college, before everything that was about to happen to both of them happened, Elizabeth saw the version of Philip he had chosen to show her, what she was not seeing, because she was 13 and had grown up inside the palace and had no way of knowing what she was not seeing, was the rest of him. Boy who had spent the previous 9 years moving between relatives across 4 countries, sleeping in other people's houses, wearing other people's hand-me-down clothes, eating at tables where he was always the guest and never quite the host. Boy whose mother had been taken away to a sanatorium in Switzerland when he was 8 years old and who had not seen her properly for 5 years afterward, whose father had retreated to a small apartment in Monte Carlo with a mistress and stayed there. 4 sisters had married into the German nobility in the years when the German nobility was acquiring a particular political character that made those marriages something the British side of the family would spend decades managing carefully. He was 18 at Dartmouth. He had been through, by that point, more than most of the people around him would experience in a lifetime. He had learned, in the way that children who are passed between adults learn it, to read rooms and read people, and to present whatever version of himself the room required. At Dartmouth, the room required a charm. He provided it in exceptional quantities. Elizabeth wrote to him after they were separated. He wrote back, less frequently with more casualness. This asymmetry in the early correspondence is itself information about how each of them understood what was developing between them. She was 13, and in the grip of something that would last for the rest of her life. 18 and aware of possibility, but not yet certain what he wanted the possibility to become. The time he came back from the war in 1945, carrying the rank of first lieutenant and the experience of combat that had included the Battle of Cape Matapan and the night engagements off the North African coast and the years of convoy escort work that nobody wrote about at the time, the picture was clearer. He was not ambivalent about Elizabeth. He had not been made ambivalent by the war. If anything, war had given him the thing he most needed before he could make the decision. A sense of himself as an individual with independent accomplishment. Something to show for his own existence that had nothing to do with his position as the minor and displaced scion of European royalty. 24 when the engagement became in effect settled. He was 25 by the time the formal announcement could be made, after the necessary changes of citizenship and religion and name had been completed. Between 24 and 25, in the months when the decision was being formalized, he made one clear choice. He was not going to spend his life performing conflict about this marriage. He was going to do it, and he was going to do it without visible reservation, and he was going to find whatever private life he needed alongside it. Choice, and it was a conscious one, visible in his behavior almost immediately after the engagement was announced, explains more about the women in his life than any individual relationship does. He did not set out to accumulate a secret history. He set out to live a life that was full enough to sustain a man of his particular energy and appetite across the decades that the public version of his life required. The women he sought the company of were the means by which he found that fullness. Some of them understood this clearly. Some of them understood it only in retrospect, and one of them, Pat Kirkwood, never accepted it as a sufficient explanation for what had been taken from her by his silence. Orange Crate story has been told so many times that it has acquired the slightly artificial quality of things that get repeated until the petition replaces the reality. But the reality it pointed at was precise and specific. Philip was born on June 10, 1921 at Mon Repos, Royal Villa on the Greek island of Corfu. The villa sat on a hill above the sea, surrounded by olive trees and the particular quality of Ionian light that makes everything it falls on look temporarily eternal. His birth was, in nature of the European royal families of the period, a small event in a complicated world. He was the fifth child and only son of a prince who was sixth in line to the Greek throne, born into a dynasty that had managed to occupy the Greek throne for less than 60 years and was by 1921 in the process of losing it again. Glucksburg dynasty had been imported to Greece in 1863, when the Greeks deposed their previous king and had asked the great powers of Europe to nominate a replacement. The great powers had nominated Prince Wilhelm of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glucksburg, who had arrived in Athens at the age of 17 and had reigned as King George I of Greece until he was assassinated in Thessaloniki in 1913. His successor, Constantine the First, was a more complicated figure who had the particular misfortune to rule a country that expected its king to be simultaneously the servant of every competing political faction and loyal to none of them. He had been forced to abdicate in 1917, and then restored in 1920, and then forced to abdicate again in 1922 in the aftermath of the catastrophic Greek military defeat in Turkey that had become known in Greek history as the Asia Minor catastrophe. Philip's father, Prince Andrew, caught in the collapse of this second abdication. As a professional soldier, Andrew had commanded Greek forces in the Anatolian campaign, and his command had been one of the ones that had been blamed in the atmosphere of military and political collapse that followed the defeat. Disaster. He was arrested, court-martialed and sentenced to exile. The trial was, by most historical accounts, political trial designed to assign blame for a catastrophe that had multiple and complicated causes. Sentence of exile was the relatively lenient outcome of a process that several of his co-defendants did not survive. Family fled in December 1922 on HMS Calypso, the British naval ship that the British government had provided. Philip was 18 months old. Orange crate story is that the makeshift cot required because the family had left so abruptly that proper provisions had not been organized is detail that has been attached to this moment of departure, and it captures something true about the terms of the escape. Hasty, improvised, dependent on the mercy of an institution that was not their own, and that was helping them because of blood connection, rather than any particular obligation. They ended up in Paris, not in triumph, not with a settled household, with the diminished dignity of foreign royalty, managing reduced circumstances with the maximum possible appearance of continuity. Family took an apartment in St. Cloud, an affluent suburb on the Seine. Prince Andrew's cousins and in-laws provided financial support of the informal and slightly embarrassing kind that displaced royals generally received from the relatives who were still solvent. The children attended French schools. Philip, too young for school in the first years, spent his time in the apartment and in the gardens of relatives' houses and, crucially, company of the Greek families who had also landed in Paris after the collapse. The Fufuni family were among those families, being prosperous Athenian merchants, close to Philip's parents in the years before the exile, had arrived in Paris at roughly the same time and in roughly the same condition. Their daughter Hélène, 3 years older than Philip, became in the early 1920s his most constant childhood companion. Played together at the family's villa in Le Touquet. They spoke the mixture of Greek and French and increasingly English that children of displaced European families speak when the ambient language is changing around them. Had the particular closeness of children who have been thrown together by circumstances that their parents are managing badly and who have, the absence of the ordinary family structures, formed a small complete world between themselves. Closeness would complicate every subsequent attempt to characterize their relationship, because childhood closeness of this particular and specific kind, the closeness of displacement and shared loss, tends to produce adult bonds that do not fit the categories usually available. They were not siblings, they were not ordinary friends. They were two people who had known each other at an age when the armor had not yet formed. There was no public image to protect and no title to manage and no palace press office to coordinate the story, and that knowledge, visibility into the unprotected version, created an attachment that persisted across everything that came afterward. Philip left Paris in 1930, when his family collapsed. He would not return to it as a place of residence. Hélène would remain a fixture of his London life in the years after the war, and the London cabaret career he helped her establish was, among other things, a way of keeping close to the last person from before everything changed. His mother's breakdown when it came quickly. 1930, when Philip was 9 years old, Princess Alice had begun to describe religious experiences that the doctors around her classified as psychotic episodes. She believed she had received divine communications. She believed she was the chosen instrument of a spiritual mission. She was also, by any reasonable assessment, a woman under enormous strain, in a marriage that had ceased to function, country that was not her own, with no money, no stable home, and 4 daughters who had all left or were leaving for marriages in Germany. Medical consensus of 1930, consulted by her family, was that she needed institutional treatment. Sigmund Freud was among those brought in for a consultation. His recommendation, offered with the confident authority of the era, that her condition had a sexual etiology, and that the appropriate intervention was to X-ray her ovaries in order to induce early menopause. 45 years old, she was taken from her home by what Hugo Vickers, her biographer, described decades later as literally a car and men in white coats, and placed in a sanatorium in Switzerland. She protested her sanity. Nobody listened. The sanatorium was in Kreuzlingen. She would not leave it for more than 2 years. Philip was 9. His father, in the months that followed his wife's committal, made his own arrangements. He installed himself in Monte Carlo with a French mistress named André de la Bigne. He did not return to Paris. He maintained technically his marriage to Alice, but he was effectively gone from the family in any practical sense that Philip could experience as a child. He would spend the rest of his life on the Riviera, drifting, drinking, declining, and Philip would see him rarely and speak of him in later years. Same flat and uninflected register he applied to all the difficult material of his early life. In 18 months of Princess Alice's institutionalization, all 4 of Philip's sisters had married and moved to Germany. Cecile in 1931, Theodore earlier, Margarita and Sophie in quick succession. 3 of the 4 had husbands who were members of, or associated with, movement that was by this point taking power in Germany. The family as a unit ceased to exist. The household in St. Cloud was dissolved. Philip was sent alone to England. He was 9 years old. The arrangement was made by his mother's family, the Mountbattens. Princess Alice's brother was George, the 2nd Marquess of Milford Haven, who was kind to Philip in his way, took him to cricket matches at Lord's and included him in the household's routines. Philip lived with him during school holidays, and also with his grandmother, the Dowager Marchioness, at her apartment in Kensington Palace. He attended Cheam, a preparatory school in Surrey, where his mother did not visit him once in the years he was there and his father visited twice. One does what one has to do. Philip would say this in various forms throughout his life. When biographers asked him about Cheam, the long school terms with no family visits, about what it felt like to be a 9-year-old boy, dropped into an English boarding school, with no functioning family behind him, he described it in the same brisk, affectless way. It was simply what happened. One got on with it. Phrase hid something, not deliberately, at least not consciously. It was simply the only language available to a person who had learned very early that expressing the thing underneath would produce nothing useful. His mother was in a Swiss institution and could not help him. Father was in Monte Carlo and would not. His sisters were in Germany and were occupied with their new lives. His uncle was kind but was not his parent. His grandmother was old and grieving. There was nobody to receive what Philip might have felt, so he developed with the efficient pragmatism of a child under pressure, the conviction that he did not feel it, at least the performance of that conviction, which in time became indistinguishable from the conviction itself. In 1933 at 12, he was sent to Schloss Salem in Germany. It was the school run by the philosopher and educator Kurt Hahn. Connection came through his sister Theodora, whose husband was Hahn's patron. The practical advantage was that family ties reduced the fees. Disadvantage was that Salem was in Germany in the first months of the Nazi government. Boys were required to give the Hitler salute on entering and leaving classrooms. Philip, by his own later account, found the salute absurd and refused to perform it. He was disciplined. The decision was made by his family that he should leave. He was sent instead to Gordonstown, the school Kurt Hahn had founded on the north coast of Scotland after fleeing Germany. Hahn was Jewish and had escaped arrest by weeks. The school he built in Moray was organized around the principles he had developed at Salem, adapted for a country that was not about to become a dictatorship. Cold showers, long runs in the Scottish weather, sailing in the North Sea, intensive physical work, an austerity of daily life designed to produce the kind of resilient, self-reliant young men that the 1930s seemed to require. Philip arrived in 1934, aged 13. He thrived. He had found, after 8 years of family chaos, a structure he could understand. Cold showers were not punishment, they were in the logic Philip had been building since Paris, a kind of pleasure. Discomfort was manageable. Comfort was in fact preferable to the other kind of exposure, the emotional kind that required you to acknowledge that something had happened to you and that it had left a mark. Running in the Scottish rain at 6 in the morning required nothing from you except the willingness to keep running. You did not have to talk about it afterward. You did not have to explain how you felt about the fact that your mother had been in a Swiss institution 4 years and you had not spoken to her once. He was made guardian, which was the school's term for head boy. He won the Burley Cup for athletics. He was captain of the cricket team and the hockey team. Kurt Hahn knew him personally. And what Hahn observed in the boy was what everyone who encountered Philip in these years observed: a quick, capable, physically magnetic young man who had deployed around the wound at his center, a personality so complete, so entertaining, so genuinely present in the room, that you could spend years in his company without ever suspecting the wound was there. 3 things happened during the Gordonstown years that would reach forward and change everything. First was the death of his sister Cecile in November 1937. She was 26 years old. Flying from Frankfurt to England with her husband Georg Donatus, the hereditary Grand Duke of Hesse, 2 eldest sons Ludwig and Alexander, and her mother-in-law. She was 4 months pregnant with a 4th child. The aircraft, Junkers Ju-52, operated by the Belgian airline Sabena, came down in fog near Ostend. Everyone aboard died. The premature baby birth appears to have been induced by the impact, died with them. Philip, 16 years old, taken out of school and brought to Darmstadt for the funeral. The photographs from that funeral are some of the most striking images in any 20th century royal family album. Philip walks behind the coffin in his school uniform between columns of men in Nazi regalia. Brother-in-law's family had organized the funeral as a state event, and the swastika armbands are everywhere in the photographs. Goering was present. Philip has been described by biographers who have studied those images as composed and unreadable. He had also, at that funeral, seen his mother for the first time in roughly 5 years. She had been released from Kreuzlingen and had returned to Athens. She attended the funeral looking thin and exhausted in the grey religious habit she had by now adopted permanently. Did not speak about the years of separation. They would never speak about them, not then and not later. The second loss was the death, April 1938, of his uncle George, the Marquess of Milford Haven, from bone marrow cancer. Philip was 17. George had been, practical and daily sense, the closest thing to a paternal figure that Philip had had for the previous 8 years. He had taken Philip to cricket. He had included him in his household. His death transferred responsibility for Philip to his other uncle, Mountbatten, universally known as Dickie, who was busy with a naval career and a complicated personal life, and had limited bandwidth for a wounded nephew, but who took the responsibility seriously, and who would remain the most important adult relationship in Philip's life until 1979. Third thing was an afternoon in July 1939 at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth. The royal family had come to visit. Chickenpox outbreak among the cadets meant that the 2 princesses, Elizabeth aged 13 and Margaret aged 8, had been confined to the captain's house to keep them away from the sick boys. Dickie Mountbatten, who was on the King's staff that day, arranged for a naval cadet to come and entertain them. The cadet was Philip. He jumped over tennis nets. He ate a large number of shrimps. 13-year-old Elizabeth watched him with an attention she was not, at 13, very skilled at disguising. Philip was 18. He was by that point strikingly good-looking in the particular way of tall, fair young men who have spent several years running in cold weather. He was also, by every account of people who met him in those years, already in possession of the presence that would define him for the rest of his life. He walked into a room and the air changed, not through effort, through something more fundamental than effort. Princess Elizabeth, who would spend the next 8 years writing him letters while he was at sea fighting a war, fallen in love with him on that afternoon at Dartmouth. She was 13, but she was not confused about what she felt, and she was not, the end, wrong about what it was. Philip, for his part, was charming to a girl he had probably met at some point at family gatherings, because the European royal families of that period were a small enough world that everyone had encountered everyone's cousins at someone else's wedding. He did not begin to understand that afternoon that the 13-year-old looking at him across the captain's lawn would become the center his life for the next 70 years. Kurt Hahn's philosophy, which Philip absorbed at Gordonstown between 1934 and 1939, and which he spent the rest of his life applying in various forms to every context that permitted it, was not simply about physical toughness. Was the visible component, the one that attracted mockery and generated anecdotes, cold showers and the long runs and the sailing in the North Sea in November. Philosophy underneath the physical toughness was more sophisticated and more consequential. Hahn believed that modern civilization had produced a deficit of the qualities he considered essential: physical fitness, enterprise, skill and care, compassion. He also believed that these qualities could be developed, that they were not innate characteristics distributed at birth, but capacities could be trained, and that the mechanism for training them was challenge, not comfort, not support, challenge. Counter with difficulty that was designed to be difficult, calibrated to test the limits of the person encountering it, offered in a context where the support available was the minimum necessary to prevent catastrophe, while the person found, through necessity, resources within themselves to meet the challenge. Philip had been formed before he ever encountered Hahn's philosophy, precisely this kind of challenge. His childhood had been a catalogue of losses and displacements and inadequate support, and the requirement to continue functioning despite all of it. Gordonstown did not create Philip's self-sufficiency. It confirmed it, gave it a name, provided it with an intellectual framework that said, "This is not merely the way you happen to turn out, is the way human beings are supposed to be formed." The confirmation was powerful. The intellectual framework was seductive. Subsequent application of the philosophy to his own children, particularly to Charles, specific mechanism through which Philip's own damage was transmitted to the next generation. The philosophy also contained something that Philip valued genuinely, and that was not simply the rationalization of his own limitations. Hahn had said, and Philip had believed, that the young people of the post-war generation needed something to do that mattered, something that tested them in ways that protected life and produced genuine competence. The mechanism for providing this was the combination of service, adventure, practical skill that the Duke of Edinburgh's award eventually formalized. The award had been Philip's largest personal project across his adult life. He had developed it with Hahn in the early 1950s and launched it in 1956. By the time of his death, it had been undertaken by approximately 8 million young people in 144 countries. These were not nominal participants. The award required genuine engagement, physical activity, skill development, service to the community, and an adventurous journey. The completion rate was high because the young people who attempted it had chosen to attempt it, and the choice to attempt a difficult thing that you are not required to do is in itself beginning of the quality Hahn had spent his career trying to produce. Philip took the award seriously in a way that he did not always take the other official functions of his life seriously. He attended events where young people received their awards with the quality of emotions that the people who witnessed those events still describe. Decades afterward, he asked real questions. He remembered specific details from previous conversations. He was interested in what they had done and what it had cost them, in the same way that he was interested in the things that had cost people something real rather than the things that were merely impressive. This quality of attention to genuine effort, corresponding impatience with performance that was not backed by actual capability, one of the things that the women who knew him well describe as a defining characteristic. He was not impressed by status or by the performance of competence. He was impressed by the actual thing, the thing you had earned through effort, quality you had developed through work that was real, rather than appearance that was managed. Women who gave him their genuine selves, rather than their managed presentations of themselves, were the women he valued. He had no patience for performance. He had considerable patience for honesty, even honesty that was inconvenient, even honesty that challenged his own positions or contradicted his own assessments. Quality he was looking for was the quality Hahn had been trying to produce all those years. Genuine capability combined with genuine honesty about what the capability was and what it was not. Between the afternoon at Dartmouth in 1939 and the wedding at Westminster Abbey in November 1947, there were 8 years of war and its aftermath, and the 8 years produced a man who was substantially different from the 18-year-old cadet who had jumped over tennis nets for a 13-year-old princess. Philip had been commissioned as a midshipman in January 1940, 6 months before his 19th birthday. First posting was to HMS Ramillies, an old battleship escorting convoys in the Indian Ocean. The war in its early stages had that quality of sitting just beyond the horizon for him. There was danger in the Atlantic, and there was building catastrophe in Europe. The Indian Ocean convoys were a long way from the immediate center of things, and Philip, young and capable, and wanted to be where the center of things was, found the assignment frustrating. He was transferred to HMS Valiant, more active ship in the Mediterranean, where the war was considerably more immediate. He was at the Battle of Matapan in March 1941. British Mediterranean fleet surprised and destroyed a force of Italian cruisers and destroyers in the darkness off the Greek coast. Philip was serving as a midshipman on the Valiant's searchlight control. He was mentioned in dispatches for his handling of the searchlights during the action, required him to illuminate enemy ships while drawing enemy fire toward his own position. He was 19 years old. Mention in dispatches was his first official recognition of exceptional service. The Battle of Matapan also coincided, an irony that biographers have noted without being able to fully explain, with the German invasion of Greece, was proceeding simultaneously about 100 miles to the north. Philip's country that had sent his father into exile 19 years earlier, was being occupied by the same Nazi Germany that had organized his sister Cecile's funeral in Darmstadt 4 years before and that had his other sister's husband serving in its armed forces. He was a British naval officer fighting against an Axis that included in its German component regime that some of his closest relatives had aligned themselves with. He had navigated this particular complexity with the same efficiency he applied to every complexity that did not have a clean resolution. British now, he served Britain. His sister's choices were their sister's choices. The war was the war. One got on with it. He spent the next several years getting on with it in the most active and most dangerous parts of the war at sea. He served in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, in waters around Southeast Asia. By the time the war ended, he had been under fire on multiple occasions, commanded men in situations where his decisions had immediate and consequential effects, and had developed the particular quality of competence under pressure that distinguished the naval officers who had been tested and from those who served in quieter postings. He had also, across these years, been corresponding with Princess Elizabeth. Correspondence is among the most private material related to the relationship, and its full content has never been made public, because neither Philip nor Elizabeth ever provided access to it, and neither their children nor their grandchildren appear to have been offered it in any form that was subsequently released. What is known about the correspondence comes from Elizabeth's governess, Marion Crawford, described in her own memoir the consistency and evident pleasure with which Elizabeth maintained it. Elizabeth kept a photograph of Philip on her mantelpiece. She did not speak about him publicly. She wrote to him and received letters in return. Combination of his physical absence and her consistent attention to his image and his correspondence suggests a quality of attachment that 8 years of war and separation did not diminish. When Philip arrived at Balmoral in the autumn of 1946, he was 25 years old, taller and sharper and harder-edged than the cadet at Dartmouth, and Elizabeth was 20 and George VI, who was watching his only daughter's obvious feeling for this young man from a displaced Greek royal family, with the complicated attention of a father who both wanted his daughter's happiness and was not entirely certain this particular young man was the right vehicle for it, gave his reluctant agreement in the autumn of 1946 to the engagement. The king's reservations were partly about Philip's suitability as a husband for heir to the throne and partly about the specific qualities of character that he had observed in Philip across the years of the royal family's acquaintance with him. Philip was capable and impressive and physically excellent in the way that the Navy tends to produce in young men it finds naturally suited to service. He was also, the king had noticed, direct in a way that bordered on abrasive, patient in a way that was charming in a 20-year-old, and might become less charming in a 40-year-old, confident in his own assessments, with a completeness that did not always make room for the assessments of others. King's reservations were prescient. They were also not sufficient to prevent the engagement, because Elizabeth wanted Philip, and Elizabeth's wants, though she had been trained since birth to subordinate them to institutional requirements, quality of quiet persistence that the people around her learned over time to respect. The wedding took place on November 20, 1947. Princess Alice attended in her grey nun's habit and sat in the royal box, Philip's 4 sisters, all of whom had been married to German officers during the years of the recent war, were not invited. The guest list was managed. All royal guest lists are managed to tell a particular story about who the family was and what it stood for. The story required the excision of the German connections that 3 of his 4 sisters represented. Philip stood at the altar as a man who had ceased, in the technical legal sense, to be the person he had been born. He had become, before the wedding, a naturalized British subject, having taken the surname Mountbatten from his uncle Dickie's anglicised family name. He had surrendered the titles of Prince of Greece and Denmark. He had been made Duke of Edinburgh, Baron Greenwich, Earl of Merioneth on the morning of the wedding. He was, by the evening of November 20, 1947, entirely different person on paper from the man who had arrived in England 37 years earlier in an orange crate on a British naval ship. He was also, in the ways that actually matter, exactly the same. The losses were still the losses. The mechanism around them was still the mechanism. Quality of his attention, and his impatience, and his humour and his cruelty were still exactly what they had been. They would remain exactly what they were for the next 73 years. The wedding at Westminster Abbey on November 20, 1947, first large public ceremony of its kind since the war, and the country received it as exactly that. Proof that the institution had survived. The future still had a shape. Rationing was still in force. The economy was in pieces. Labour government was managing the controlled unravelling of empire, while simultaneously trying to build a welfare state on a budget that barely covered either project. London still carried the physical marks of bombing in sites that would not be cleared for years. Into this context, Abbey produced orange blossom and candlelight, and a princess in a Norman Hartnell gown with an 8-foot train. 200 million people around the world listened to the radio broadcast. Philip wore the uniform of a naval lieutenant. He had been made a prince by the king the morning of the wedding. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, not Philip Mountbatten as he had briefly been. Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark as he had been born. The name changes, the citizenship change, the religious conversion, all of it accomplished in the weeks before the ceremony, with the efficiency that palace operations could achieve when motivated. Carried it off with an ease that the photographers caught in every image of the day. Bearing of a man who has been in uniform in conditions far more demanding than an abbey full of foreign royals and government ministers. Princess Alice sat near the front in a grey nun's habit. She had arrived from Athens wearing the habit of the religious order she had founded there, to the war, and she would not change it for the ceremony. Philip had not seen her regularly for the previous 15 years. Reunion between them had not been simple. She was deaf, she was ascetic. She had survived the German occupation of Greece by hiding a Jewish family in her apartment at personal risk while her son was fighting across the Mediterranean. She had emerged from the war thinner and more absolute in her religious commitments than she had been when she entered it. Grey habit was not a performance, it was the truth of who she had become. Philip's 4 sisters were not there, had married German officers and noblemen, and they had remained in Germany. Feeling inside the palace was that their presence at a British royal wedding in 1947 would be politically untenable. This was correct. Also devastating in the way that correct institutional decisions sometimes are. Philip had lost his mother for years. Father had essentially absented himself, and the sisters, who had been the last remaining anchor of family in his peripatetic childhood, had married into the wrong side of the war. At his own wedding, the people who constituted his personal history were either absent, in mourning clothes, or wearing a nun's habit. He did not show this. He was 26 years old, and he stood at the altar, and he said his vows with the calm of a man who decided what he is doing. People who were there remember the steadiness of it. No hesitation, no visible struggle. The photographs bear this out. Philip in every image is present, is focused, is here. What was inside that steadiness is a question none of the people who were present could answer. 26-year-old man carries into the building where he is about to surrender the operational structure of his own life, his naval career, his name, his freedom of movement, his ability to walk down a street unaccompanied, is not available for public reading. Carries out of it is somewhat more legible, in retrospect. He came out married to a woman he loved and committed to an institution he did not fully understand yet, and which, once he did understand it, he found oppressive in ways he spent 60 years attempting to manage. He would not be alone in any room again. That was perhaps the simplest form the change took. From November 20, 1947 forward, was always a detective nearby, always a secretary, always a member of staff within calling distance. Solitude he had learned to inhabit in the years of being moved between relatives, the particular self-sufficiency of a person who has learned people around them may not stay, was now institutionally unavailable to him. He was never quite alone again. Philip was at Gordonstown, and then at Dartmouth, and then fighting a war across the Mediterranean and the Pacific. Hélène Fufuni was building a different kind of life. She had been born in Athens in 1917 into a prosperous Greek merchant family. Children, who had run through the streets of Paris together in the late 1920s, had followed the same European upheaval in different directions. She ended up in London. She worked as a cabaret performer and eventually as a television presenter, becoming the hostess of a BBC variety show called Café Continental that ran through the 1950s and made her a recognizable face in British households. She was attractive, dark-haired, with the kind of self-possession that comes from having navigated a complicated life with considerable style. In 1938, before the war, she had married an Englishman named William Kirby. Philip, who was 17 at the time, had walked her down the aisle. Kirby's marriage did not survive. She entered a relationship with Marcel Boisseau, captain in the Free French Air Force, who had distinguished himself early in the war by flying a Marine 315 training aircraft, without navigation equipment and without maps. From Morocco to Gibraltar, he and Hélène would eventually marry, but not before she had 2 children. First Max was born in the early 1940s. The second, Louise, was born on February 8, 1945. Documented father on the official record for both children was Marcel Boisseau. Philip stood as godfather to both children. He arranged for Max. Time came to attend Gordonstown, the school he himself had attended, and he paid a portion of the fees directly. He also helped Hélène, years after the war, to establish her London cabaret career. He remained close to her family until her death in 1996. In London in the 1950s, combination of facts produced one of the most persistent rumors attached to Philip's name. Rumors held that Hélène had been his lover at some point in the late 1930s or the wartime period. They held that Max was his son. Circulated in the gossip columns that were beginning in that decade to find the edges of what could be written about the royal family, were denied by everyone involved. Hélène addressed the rumors in her 1961 memoir, Born Bewildered. The address was, as several reviewers at the time noted, careful rather than absolute. She did not deny knowing Philip, did not deny that their relationship had been close. What she declined to do was confirm or deny the specific allegation of paternity. The line itself, so precise and so measured in a book that was otherwise confessional by the standards of the period, kept the question alive. Max, when the question was put to him directly in later life, answered it with the directness of a man who had been living with the question since childhood. He had built a distinguished academic career as a professor of strategic management at the Assad Business School in Barcelona. He had become, in professional terms, quite a different person from the figure in the London gossip columns. When asked about Philip, he said, "Rumors are ridiculous. My father, my real father, lives in Paris. This goes back to their childhood friendship and there is nothing more to it." He died in September 2011, having maintained that position for 50 years. His sister Louise has never altered the family account. Blood relationship between Max Boisseau and Marcel Boisseau has never been disputed by anyone with access to the actual evidence. Has never fully dissipated is the question of why, exactly, the nature of the relationship between Philip and Hélène required the particular kind of discretion that their mutual silence produced across 5 decades. The question was not unfair. Philip paid his godson's school fees at a school that cost, in the 1950s, more than most working families earned in a year. He advanced Hélène's career at a time when a word from him could open doors that were otherwise closed. He maintained a close friendship with her across 60 years of his marriage, until her death in 1996. He attended her divorces, present at her remarriages. These are not the behaviors of a man maintaining a casual childhood acquaintance. Answer offered by those who knew them both was consistently that the friendship was exactly what it appeared to be. Long, genuine, complicated by circumstances, and important to both of them in ways that did not require a scandal to explain. Philip had very few people in his life from before the marriage. Hélène was one of them. She knew the boy in Paris, not the Duke at Buckingham Palace, was its own kind of value, and it was the kind of value that Philip, surrounded as he was by people whose relationship to him was mediated by his title and his position, would have protected with some care. Rumors existed and were never resolved. Philip never addressed them personally. He never confirmed and he never denied, and he let the silence operate exactly as he had learned in childhood that silence could operate. Kind of protection, absorbing suspicion without either validating or refuting it. In October 1948, 8 months after the marriage to Princess Elizabeth, 8 months pregnant with the child who would become King Charles III, Philip arrived at the dressing room of a woman named Pat Kirkwood at the London Hippodrome. He had been brought there by Baron Nahum, court and society photographer who was one of his closest friends in that period, and who was at the time in a relationship with Kirkwood. Baron, he was universally known, had attended the wedding the previous year as a guest of the groom's party. He was, by all accounts, gifted and charming man who moved easily between the worlds of theatre, journalism, high society and the royal household, who had become the effective social organizer of the circle that Philip, now confined to the constraints of royal life, still found ways to maintain. Kirkwood was at that point the highest paid actress on the London stage. She was also the description of the theatre critic Kenneth Tynan, the owner of legs that constituted the eighth wonder of the world. She was every surviving photograph, strikingly beautiful in the style of the period, and she was, by every account of the people who knew her, woman of genuine wit and formidable self-possession. Philip came to her dressing room. The evening that followed would destroy her professional life. The Malta years are the period that both Philip and Elizabeth, in the rare moments when either of them discussed their marriage in terms that had any personal content at all, described as the closest they came to an ordinary life. Philip had been posted to Malta as a naval officer in 1949, initially as first lieutenant on HMS Chequers and subsequently in command of HMS Magpie. The posting was a genuine posting, not an honorary or ceremonial one of the kind that the palace machinery tended to produce when dealing with a member of the royal family. He commanded a ship. He made decisions that were his to make. He was responsible for men and equipment in the way that a naval officer is responsible. Directness and an immediacy that the institutional life of Buckingham Palace never provided. Elizabeth came to Malta for substantial periods during those 2 years. They rented a villa, Edwina Mountbatten, Dickie's wife, also in Malta for much of this period, because Dickie was Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean Fleet, and Malta was the fleet's base. Social world the two couples occupied was small and comfortable. They attended parties at other officers' houses and had people to parties at theirs. Elizabeth drove herself around the island in the way that, back in England, she was never permitted to drive herself anywhere. She shopped in the Valletta markets. She learned for a period what it was like to be the wife of a naval officer rather than the heir to the throne. Great Britain, both of them understood, and both of them recognized that the other understood, that this period was temporary. George VI's health was deteriorating. The king, who had never been physically robust, who had endured the war and the stress of accession in a condition of constitutional anxiety that had exacted a real physiological cost, declining in the way of men whose bodies have absorbed too much strain. The end, when it came in February 1952, was not unexpected. Elizabeth had gone to Kenya at the beginning of February for a scheduled royal tour. Philip was with her. They were at Treetops, Wildlife Observation Hotel in the Aberdare Forest when the news arrived. Philip was the one who told her. End of the Malta period meant the end of the last version of their lives in which they were relatively free to be people rather than symbols. Elizabeth became queen, Philip became consort. The institution became, in a way it had not quite been before, central fact of both of their existences, and everything they were personally was arranged around that central fact for the next 70 years. Philip, who had commanded a ship, now had no command. The Duke of Edinburgh's award would give him something to build, something that was genuinely his and that had genuine consequences for the young people it reached. But in 1952, in the immediate aftermath of the accession, he was still finding the shape of what his life would be. He was 30 years old. He had given up more than he had been promised he would need to give up. The loss of his naval career, which had been presented to him as temporary when the marriage was being negotiated, had turned out to be permanent. He was not going to command a destroyer. He was not going to have a life of practical operational competence that rewarded the things he was actually. He was going to attend events and stand beside his wife and represent an institution. Social world of the Thursday Club was one response to this constraint. The carriage driving was another, taken up 20 years later when the polo that had been his physical release was no longer something his body could sustain. Women who came into his life in ways that were personal rather than institutional were another response. in the sense that each of them provided, in different ways and in different contexts, the quality of being in the presence of someone who was not there because of his position but because of who he was. This was across the arc of his life, the rarest quality available to him. The people who knew him only as the Duke of Edinburgh, only as the royal consort, only as the man walking 2 steps behind, encountered a performance that was polished and effective and entirely controlled. The people who came close enough to know the man on the other side of the performance found someone substantially different. People who could tolerate or even appreciate the qualities on the other side of the performance, the impatience, the bluntness, occasional cruelty, the absolute refusal to pretend, were the people who stayed in his life. Thursday Club requires some context before it can be understood as anything other than a boys' night out, which is how the palace preferred it to be understood, and which is in part but not completely what it was. Had been founded in the years immediately after the war by a photographer named Sterling Henry Nahum, professionally known simply as Baron, who was one of the genuinely interesting figures on the periphery of royal life in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Baron had been born in Nottingham in 1906, the son of a Jewish diamond merchant of Middle Eastern origin. He had built a career as a society and commercial photographer in the years before the war that had placed him at the intersection of the autocratic world, the theatrical world, and the bohemian world that coexisted in the close geography of Mayfair and Soho. He was charming, sociable, extremely funny, and interested in people in the way that the best photographers are interested in people, not as social types but as specific individuals with specific qualities of light. He had photographed the royal family on several occasions and had developed a genuine friendship with Philip, found in Baron the kind of company that his new position made increasingly rare. Baron did not defer. He did not manage the social situation around Philip. He talked to Philip as he talked to everyone else, which is to say directly with wit, the comfortable assumption that the person across the table was capable of handling directness. The private room at Wheeler's, which was and remains one of the better fish restaurants in London, became, every Thursday evening through the early 1950s, location for a gathering that was not exactly a club and was not exactly a dinner party, but was some combination of both. Regular attendees occupied a range that would have been implausible to anyone organizing a dinner party with a social purpose. David Niven was a film actor of considerable charm and a wartime officer of genuine distinction. Peter Ustinov was an actor-writer, mimic of extraordinary range. John Betjeman was a poet who would eventually become poet laureate. James Robertson Justice was a Scottish actor and naturalist who held a doctorate from something called the University of Göttingen and had a personality that, by all surviving accounts, made Philip's own bluntness look positively diplomatic. These men had in common a quality that the courtiers and equerries and palace officials who surrounded Philip for the rest of the week did not have. Were completely unimpressed by his title. They were interested in his company. Those are different things. Difference mattered enormously to a man who had spent most of his waking life surrounded by people who stood at careful angles to him and chose their words with institutional precision. What happened at the Thursday Club evenings has been the subject of speculation for 60 years. Parker, who was Philip's closest companion at those evenings throughout the early 1950s, died in 2001, having said almost nothing. General answer he gave when the subject was raised in the last years of his life was that men talked, drank, ate good fish, kept their business to themselves. He offered this in the tone of a man who regarded the question as fundamentally impertinent. Were women at or adjacent to the Thursday Club evenings? The club itself was formerly male-only in the tradition of its time and setting. Social world it existed within was not male-only, and the evenings did not end at Wheeler's for all the participants. Happened after Wheeler's, in the various locations that various participants moved on to, the operational detail that the palace and the participants declined to document. Princess Elizabeth's phrase, Philip's funny friends, heard by enough people that it survived in the biographical record. The phrase is doing several things at once. It is affectionate, is dismissive in the slightly competitive way that partners sometimes dismiss the social world of the person they are with. And it is also, you know Philip, exactly accurate. They were funny, they were his friends. And whatever else they were or whatever else they did, quality that made the Thursday Club evenings valuable to Philip was the quality of being for several hours a week himself. Barron died in September 1956. Something that had functioned as Philip's most reliable decompression mechanism was removed. Man who had organized the Thursday evenings, who had kept the social architecture around them working, was gone. Club would dissolve within a year. The world it had inhabited, the particular bohemian social geography of post-war London that had contained the base for this kind of gathering, was changing too. The city was becoming something different. The press was becoming something different. Informal agreements that had protected Philip's Thursday evenings were becoming harder to enforce as a new generation of journalists came of age, who had not been formed in the culture that produced those agreements and who were less inclined to honor them. Tanya Tour left in October 1956, 6 weeks after Barron's death. Philip took with him Mike Parker, his closest friend. 4-month journey across the southern hemisphere had the quality of a long farewell to the kind of life he had been living since the marriage. When he returned in February 1957, the press storm was already beginning. Parker's wife was filing for divorce. Alice was preparing the denial it had never prepared before, and the informal architecture of the bachelor-husband arrangement was under a public pressure it had not previously faced. The arrangement survived, as these arrangements do in institutions built for endurance. Changed was its visibility. Philip became more careful. The social circle became more discreet. Women whose names eventually circulated were the women whose proximity to him had been observable enough that the observation could not be entirely managed away, and the management effort that previously had been relaxed now had to be sustained. They went first to Les Ambassadeurs, restaurant in Mayfair that was exactly the kind of place where people who wished to be seen could be seen. Also exactly the kind of place where a royal duke dining with someone who was not his wife of 8 months after his wedding would be noticed. Then they went to the Milroy nightclub, where Philip and Kirkwood danced together until dawn. Some accounts have them eating scrambled eggs somewhere after that with others present. Kirkwood, in every account she ever gave, described the evening as a group outing, emphasized that she and Philip had danced at arm's length, rejected with genuine anger any description of the evening as an intimate encounter. She also said, in one of the more piercing lines spoken by anyone connected to Philip's life, "I suspect he felt trapped and rarely got a chance to be himself." Line is worth holding, because it captures, in a way that the rumors around the evening never quite managed to capture, the evening was actually about for Philip. He was, in October 1948, 8 months into a marriage that had fundamentally reorganized his life. He had surrendered his Greek royal title, renounced his Danish title, given up his promising naval career, and accepted a role of royal consort that Britain had no real structure for, and that the old guard of Buckingham Palace regarded with something between puzzlement and contempt. He was not yet 30 years old. He was, by every account of the people around him in that period, bored, restless, and struggling to find the edges of the cage he had just agreed to live in. Princess Elizabeth, who genuinely loved him, could not provide what an evening like that provided. Not because she lacked intelligence or warmth or any of the qualities he valued in a woman, because she was the future Queen of England, and an evening at the Milroy dancing until the light came up over Mayfair was not something the future Queen of England could provide or participate in. Pat Kirkwood provided it. She had no interest in managing an image or navigating a household or representing anything institutional. She was a dancer and a singer and a wit, and she gave Philip several hours of exactly the kind of freedom that his new life had systematically removed. None of this is sufficient to justify what followed. Kirkwood knew it. She spent the rest of her life knowing it. Rumors that attached themselves to her name after that evening were the particular kind of rumor that could not be definitively refuted without legal action. Philip and Kirkwood had been seen in public. They had been seen dancing together, been seen at a nightclub until the early hours of the morning, while his wife, the future queen, was visibly pregnant at home. Circumstantial case was not one that anyone with experience of how these things work in British society could easily dismiss. So the dismissal was never really complete, and the rumor was never really laid to rest. What Kirkwood wanted and asked for, denied for the rest of her life, was a statement from Philip. Not a legal denial, not a sworn affidavit. A simple statement that there had been nothing improper between them. She had not done anything wrong. She had spent one evening in the company of a man she had been introduced to by her boyfriend. Evening had left her name attached to a story that followed her career for 50 years. Philip's response: relayed through intermediaries because he would not address the subject directly, was essentially a refusal to engage. He wrote to Kirkwood, in the letters that would be held by her friend Michael Thornton, after her death and passed eventually to Philip's official biographer. According to Thornton, the letters contained nothing that confirmed or denied the impropriety. They contained, apparently, sentiment that was almost more maddening than silence. Short of starting libel proceedings, Philip conveyed, there is absolutely nothing to be done. Invasion of privacy and the rest of it are simply the price of the life we lead. The price he paid. The price she paid were, of course, entirely different prices. Kirkwood received 4 Royal Variety Performance engagements across her career. She never received an honor, not an MBE, a mention in the honors list. Her 4th husband, Peter Knight, who was with her when she died on Christmas Day 2007 at a nursing home in Ilkley, the absence explicit. My wife has been a star for 66 years and has given a lifetime service to the public and to charity. Anyone else with her prominence in the field of pantomime and musicals would have been made a dame of the British Empire. I am reliably informed that the reason is Prince Philip. Thornton, who had custody of the Kirkwood-Philip correspondence, made one of the most precise formulations about the subject that anyone has produced. He said, "Nothing in the letters confirms that anything improper occurred." But he also quoted Kirkwood's own unforgettable statement to a journalist. "A lady is not normally expected to defend her honor. It is the gentleman who should do that. Would have had a happier and easier life if Prince Philip, instead of coming uninvited to my dressing room, gone home to his pregnant wife on the night in question." She met him again apparently on 6 further occasions. She maintained a correspondence with him across the years. She died without the public statement she had wanted. He died without having provided it. Pat Kirkwood's story is, on its surface, a story about whether or not a royal duke was unfaithful to his wife on a particular October evening in 194. At that level it is unresolvable, and the letters that will eventually reach his official biographer may or may not resolve it. At another level, the story is about something Philip understood very clearly. The machinery of the institution he represented was capable of absorbing almost any accusation. The silence of the palace press office was itself a kind of inoculation against the worst of what the press could do. The women who found themselves adjacent to him did not have access to that machinery, and could not call on it when their own reputations needed defending. Pat Kirkwood paid a professional price for an evening that Philip experienced as freedom. That asymmetry would repeat itself in different forms across the women whose names became attached to his. Thursday Club had been operating for several years by the time the Kirkwood incident occurred. Met on Thursday evenings in a private upstairs room at Wheeler's restaurant in Old Compton Street in Soho, and it was organized by Baron Nahum, brought Philip into the evening at the Hippodrome. The membership at any given Thursday was between 10 and 15 men. It included, various times, the actor David Niven, the actor and writer Peter Ustinov, the actor James Robertson Justice, the poet John Betjeman, MP Ian MacLeod, who would later become Chancellor of the Exchequer. Princess Elizabeth is reported to have referred to this group, polished dryness that suggests she understood exactly what she was dealing with, as Philip's funny friends. Club was a mechanism for Philip to spend several hours a week being exactly not what he was required to be for the other 160-odd hours. He could be loud, argumentative, funny in ways that had no diplomatic function, interested in women who interested him, completely free of the requirement to manage anyone's impression of the institution. It operated in the pre-tabloid era of British journalism, where a gentleman's agreement between the press and the palace extended to keeping the Duke of Edinburgh's Thursday evenings out of the papers. Baron Nahum, who died of a heart attack in September 1956, was the social architect of this arrangement. Without him, the club began to thin. Anger Pat Kirkwood carried for 59 years deserves more attention than it usually receives, because it is one of the clearer pieces of testimony available about what it actually cost to be on the wrong side of Philip's institutional protection. She had been born in Pendleton, Salford in 1921, which made her exactly the same age as Philip, born in the same year on the same day in February, which is one of the coincidences of the case that has no significance, but is occasionally cited by people who find coincidences meaningful. She had made her London stage debut at 16 as Dandini in a pantomime. Time she was in her mid-20s, she was the highest paid actress on the London stage. Kenneth Tynan's line about her legs being the 8th wonder of the world had attached itself to her reputation and had been useful in some ways and Training in others, she was more than her legs. She was a singer, a dancer, a comedienne, a woman of considerable theatrical intelligence who had been performing in front of audiences since she was a teenager and who had developed experienced the particular kind of self-possession that comes from years of standing in front of very large rooms and requiring the people in to pay attention. When Baron brought Philip to her dressing room in October 1948, she was not starstruck. She had been around enough of the theatrical and social world to understand how introductions of this kind worked and what was usually expected of the person being introduced to. She was, in her own description, polite and hospitable, because those were the things you were when someone's company arrived in your dressing room. She was, by her own account, particularly interested in Philip, except as a guest of her boyfriend's who required the ordinary hospitality extended to any guest. Followed was not, by her account, the scandalous evening that the gossip columns implied. She and Philip and Baron and others present went to dinner, then to the Milroy, then Philip and Kirkwood danced. Philip was a good dancer, was a thing he had been since his naval officer days, and which, given the context of his life, quality that should perhaps not surprise anyone who thinks about what dancing provides: physical movement in close proximity to another person, music, in a social setting designed to make physical movement in close proximity seem natural and unremarkable. They danced at arm's length. Others were present. Scrambled eggs appeared at some point in the early hours. This was the evening. The evening was, in Kirkwood's experience of it, lively and pleasant night, out in the company of a man who was good company when he was not being the Duke of Edinburgh. Philip's experience of it, the evening, was probably similar, and also, given the context of his life at that moment, kind of evening that felt like oxygen after weeks of constraint. What neither of them had fully calculated was the observation problem. Been seen. The dinner was at Les Ambassadeurs, where people were seen by design. Milroy was a nightclub where the people who attended were the kind of people who noticed each other and talked about what they noticed. Philip was not an anonymous man. He was not even, in October 1948, a particularly private man in the sense of someone whose whereabouts were not tracked. He was the husband of the future Queen of England, and he was out for the evening without his wife, and everyone in those rooms knew it. Observation moved, as observations do in a city whose social structure is built around the management and circulation of information, to the form of a rumour. The rumour moved from the dinner tables of Mayfair into the gossip columns of London. Gossip columns of London moved it into the permanent record of things that were known about Philip and the women he spent time with. Kirkwood spent the next several years watching the rumour circulate and recirculate, attached to her name in ways she could not control, producing an association she had not consented to, and that was damaging her in specific professional ways. She wrote to Philip. Content of the letters has not been made public, but the purpose of the letters which Thornton has described was the request for a statement. She asked him to say that the evening had been innocent, and that there was nothing between them. Philip did not provide the statement. He was sympathetic in his letters. He was not, by the account of his responses as Thornton has described them, cold or dismissive or unkind. He was something more frustrating than cold. He was regretful but ineffective. He conveyed the view that short of starting libel proceedings, there was nothing to be done. It was an assessment of the situation that was tactically accurate and completely inadequate as a response to the request she was making. She was asking was not legally difficult. It was personally difficult. It required him to make a statement that confirmed he had been in her company on that evening, would require him to acknowledge that he had been out until dawn without his wife, while his wife was 8 months pregnant. Palace Press Office, which had been managing his image for years, would not have found this statement welcome. The Queen, who had been 8 months pregnant at home when the evening occurred, would have had her own feelings about the statement. Institutional weight of everything that the marriage and the monarchy represented was on the side of not making the statement. Kirkwood was on the other side, just her and her career and the 59 years she had left. She died having made 4 Royal Variety performance appearances across a career that spanned 66 years. She died without an honour. She died without the statement. Her 1999 autobiography was called The Time of My Life. Is either an extraordinary act of equanimity or an extraordinary act of irony. Kirkwood was intelligent enough that it was probably both simultaneously. She had known the time of her life. She had also known the cost of it. Coronation Tour of 1953 and 1954 was Philip's longest period away from his family since the end of the war, and it was also the accounts of the people who travelled with him, the period in which he began to understand, in a way that Malta had not fully produced, the specific nature of the life he was going to be living. Elizabeth had been crowned on June 2, 1953. Philip had walked behind her into Westminster Abbey wearing his coronation robe, carrying no regalia, performing no formal function in the ceremony, except the one that was personal rather than constitutional. He was the first person to kneel before her after the crown was placed on her head and pay homage, and he was the person who, when he rose from his knee, took her face in his hands and kissed her cheek with a completeness of feeling that every photographer in the Abbey was watching for. 6 months later, in November 1953, they departed on a tour of the Commonwealth that would last 6 months and take them through the Caribbean, Australia, New Zealand, Ceylon, Uganda, Malta, and Gibraltar. The tour was the first the new Queen had made since her accession, and it was designed to accomplish what coronation tours accomplish: to present the new monarch to the populations of the Commonwealth territories in physical, visible form that would confirm the continuity of the institution and express its genuine regard for the people it was responsible to. Philip was part of the tour as the Queen's consort, which meant that his function at every official event was the function of the consort: to support, to facilitate, to be present at the appropriate angle and the appropriate distance, to engage the people who were not the primary official recipients of the Queen's attention, with the directness and personal ease that he was genuinely good at, and that for many people at the various official functions was the more memorable encounter. He was 32 years old. He had a young family that was being looked after in England by the Queen Mother and by the household staff who managed the children during the parents' absence. Charles was 5, Anne was 3. He had been married for 6 years and had already learned across those 6 years basic shape of the life he was going to be living for the next 6 decades. The tour was also, away from the official functions, first extended period in which Philip had been, in the practical sense, removed from the immediate scrutiny that attended every moment of life at Buckingham Palace. The official functions were scrutinized. Scheduled events were photographed, but the long hours on the ship between ports, the evenings that were not organized around an official program, social world that formed among the officers and the accompanying staff in the informal spaces of the extended voyage, were not scrutinized in the same way. This was the context in which the bachelor-husband arrangement, it would eventually be characterized in the biographies, first operated at scale. Parker was with him. Ship was an environment in which the institutional weight of the palace was present in a formal sense, but not operative in the continuous and personal way it was operative when they were in London. Philip was not free on the Britannia in any absolute sense. He was, compared to life at the palace, considerably less constrained. The tour ended in May 1954. Philip returned to England and resumed the life that the coronation had permanently reorganized. He never ceased to understand what he had agreed to. He never ceased to perform what the agreement required. He also never ceased to find ways to maintain, within the constraints of the agreement, qualities that the agreement had been designed to manage. The arrangement that governed Philip's life in the early years of the marriage was built on an understanding that was never formalized and never discussed between himself and his wife, which both of them grasped with the quiet completeness of two intelligent people who had chosen, for their own reasons, to examine it too closely. He would keep his social world. She would not ask about it. Palace press office would manage whatever consequences arose from the social world, and the institution would absorb the cost. He would, in exchange, appear where he was required, perform his public functions with the energy and engagement that his own genuine sense of duty demanded, be visibly present beside her at the events and ceremonies that required his presence. He would also, in the long view and the honest one, faithful to her in the way that the men of his generation and background and social orbit understood faithfulness, which to say that he would not leave her, would not love anyone else in the way that he loved her, not create a scandal that the institution could not absorb. Whether that understanding also accommodated extramarital relationships is the question that has circled his biography for 6 decades and has never received a definitive answer. Closest anyone has come to a definitive answer came from a royal biographer named Sarah Bradford, who wrote in 2001, "Duke of Edinburgh has had affairs, yes, full-blown affairs, and more than one, not with Pat Kirkwood or Merle Oberon or any of those people. All that was nonsense, complete nonsense. I do not think there was ever anything in any of that. But he has had affairs, and the Queen accepts it. Bradford did not name names. She had apparently been told names by sources inside the royal household who trusted her discretion, and she had honored that discretion. The names she declined to provide have never been established through documentary evidence. Philip's own contribution to the subject made in 1992 to a reporter who asked him how he could possibly conduct affairs given the constant presence protection officers was a question in return. Have you ever stopped to think that for the past 40 years I have never moved anywhere, without a policeman accompanying me? So how the hell could I get away with anything like that? The question was designed to produce laughter. Produced laughter. Was also a non-answer dressed as a refutation. Was a move he had perfected across decades of navigating intrusive questions with the particular dexterity of a man who had spent 70 years public eye, and had never once told the public more than he had chosen to. In the spring of 1956, Philip departed on the Royal Yacht Britannia for what was planned as a 5-month Commonwealth tour. His equerry and closest friend, Lieutenant Commander Michael Parker, accompanied him. The tour was officially described as a scientific expedition in the Southern Hemisphere. Actual itinerary included visits to various Commonwealth territories and a great deal of time at sea away from photographers, away from the press, and away from Buckingham Palace. What happened during those months at sea has never been fully documented. Parker, who maintained throughout the rest of his long life an absolute discretion about the Britannia tour, told his biographer that it was a 5-month stag do, and the biographer included the line in a biography published after Parker's death in 2001. Line has never been confirmed or refuted by anyone with direct knowledge. The trouble began in the first week of February 1957. Parker's wife, Eileen, filed for divorce in London. The grounds were adultery. The named correspondent was not Philip. He was an unnamed woman in the West End connected to Barron's social circle. But the press had been waiting for years for a story that could be run. Picked up the Parker divorce, and the implication of the Britannia tour and the unnamed woman almost simultaneously. The Baltimore Sun, which was not subject to the informal agreements that governed the British press's coverage, Royal Family, ran the story on February 8, 1957. It reported that gossip in London held that the Duke of Edinburgh was romantically involved. Unnamed woman he met regularly at the West End establishment of a society photographer. The photographer by inference was Baron Nahum, who had died the previous September. The unnamed woman was apparently well enough known in certain circles that the Sun's London correspondent felt confident identifying the association without identifying the person. The story ran for 2 weeks. British newspapers, constrained by libel law from running it directly, ran adjacent stories about the Parker divorce and the Britannia tour, and allowed their readers to draw the obvious connections. On February 11, 1957, Buckingham Palace issued a statement. The Palace Press Office had for 50 years maintained an absolute institutional policy of never commenting on any rumor about any member of the royal family. Broke that policy. The statement given to the court circular and to the senior royal correspondents was one sentence. Quite untrue that there is any rift between the Queen and the Duke. In the lexicon of palace communications, statement was as close to a public crisis as the institution had produced in the post-war period. Principle of the no-comment policy existed precisely because official denials lend credibility to the underlying accusation by acknowledging that requires denial. The palace understood this. They denied anyway. The fact that they denied confirmed every experienced journalist who covered the institution that the story had come close enough to something real to require management. Parker resigned his position as Philip's equerry within days of the denial. The palace described it as his own decision, taken to spare the royal family embarrassment. The reality, according to several accounts from people inside the household in that period, that the Queen Mother and the senior household had decided that his presence was incompatible with the institution's dignity and had communicated to him with the clarity that senior palace officials reserve for communications that are not actually optional. Parker returned to Australia. He never wrote about the Britannia tour. He maintained for the 44 years between the February 1957 crisis and his death in 2001, silence that was absolute and that produced in its absoluteness its own kind of statement. The Thursday Club itself did not survive the year. Barron had died in September 1956. Without his organizational energy, the weekly gatherings at Wheeler's began to thin. The press storm of February 1957, the remaining members found the meetings less attractive. The private rooms ceased to be reserved. The early 1960s, the club had effectively dissolved. What it had represented in Philip's life did not dissolve. The need it had served, for a space outside the palace machinery, for relationships not mediated by title or rank, particular quality of social freedom that comes when nobody in the room needs anything from you, continued to shape the choices he made. He found other spaces, other houses, other women who provided something the palace could not. Voyage that began in October 1956 and ended in February 1957 was officially a royal tour of Commonwealth nations. Philip had joined the royal yacht Britannia at Gibraltar and sailed south, in places that the official itinerary describes in the language of diplomatic courtesy: the Gambia, Antarctica, the Falkland Islands, Zealand, Australia, Papua New Guinea. The voyage covered 39,000 miles. It lasted 4 months. It was, by every institutional metric, a successful exercise in Commonwealth relations. What happened alongside it, press and in the palace, and in the households of the people involved, was something else. Parker was Philip's private secretary and best friend. They had known each other since 1942, when they had served together in the Royal Navy. Parker had been with Philip at the beginning of everything. At the Tuesday lunches with the couple, when they were still figuring out the shape of household in the early years of the marriage, when Philip was still working out what the role of consort actually required of him day to day. He was the person Philip trusted most inside the institutional structure, which was saying something, because Philip's trust was not easily given. February 1957, while Britannia was still at sea, Eileen Parker filed for divorce. The specific ground she cited was adultery. Eileen Parker had been an unhappy wife for years. Her marriage to Mike had been deteriorating through most of the period since the war. Timing of the filing, while her husband was aboard a yacht with the Duke of Edinburgh, was not an accident. She had chosen it deliberately. She wanted out, and she wanted the machinery of divorce proceedings to begin before Mike could return and complicate the process. Baltimore Sun ran a story on February 8 citing unnamed sources who suggested that the Parker divorce pointed to something larger, that there was trouble in the Philip-Elizabeth marriage as well, that the Britannia voyage had not been entirely what the official schedule claimed it was. The story did not name names beyond the Parkers, but the implication was clear enough to everyone reading it. Buckingham Palace issued a statement denying any rift in the marriage. The statement was unusual in form. Palace rarely issued denials of this kind, because the act of denial itself dignifies the story being denied. The fact that the palace chose to issue one in this case was understood by everyone in Fleet Street as a measure of how seriously the institution took the threat. Parker resigned from his post as private secretary on the day the Baltimore Sun story appeared. He was not given the option of riding out the controversy. He was asked to remove himself, and he did so, returning to Australia, where he spent the rest of his life with a studied and consistent silence about the 1956-57 voyage and what had or had not occurred on it. He died in 2001 without having said anything directly about the events of those months that could be used against anyone. Was either loyalty or legal caution or both. His divorce from Eileen was finalized. The woman who had been cited as the reason for it was not a woman whose name entered the public record in any usable form. The story of what happened on the Britannia between October 1956 and February 1957 remains in its specific details unverifiable. Parker did not tell it. Philip did not tell it. The palace's denial, issued once and never repeated, stands as the official version. Can be said is this: Philip had been at sea for 4 months in circumstances that were more relaxed than anything his public life in London allowed. He was the senior figure aboard the yacht. The crew and the accompanying staff operated in the particular atmosphere that remote voyages create, a temporary removal from the social pressures and domestic arrangements of ordinary life. Temporary suspension of the usual accountabilities. Men who spend months at sea in those conditions in those years not typically emerge from the experience having behaved exactly as they would have behaved if they had remained at home with their wives. Sarah Bradford, the biographer who wrote about Philip with the cooperation of a number of his circle, put the point as directly as anyone has been willing to put it in print. She said that Philip had had affairs, full-blown affairs, more than one. She specified that Pat Kirkwood was not among them. She did not specify who was, but she was clear that the Queen accepted this reality, that the palace's management of the question had been throughout less about denial of fact than about control of narrative. Philip's own response on the occasions when the question was put to him directly, which were few, because journalists who asked it did not get second interviews, was to point out practicality that was either entirely genuine or a perfect performance of being entirely genuine. He had never in his adult life moved anywhere without a police detective beside him. He asked with evident interest in the answer how anyone imagined he could have arranged anything. He left the question there. He did not answer it. He asked it and moved on. The speed with which he moved was itself a kind of answer. Mike Parker from Australia said nothing. Eileen Parker said, interviews given later in her life, that she had known about the relationship with the unnamed woman before the divorce. She had known for some time, and that the decision to file when she did had been primarily about protecting herself rather than exposing anyone else. She did not elaborate on what she had known. She died in 2012. The specific shape of what she knew died with her. If you have been watching this, and you are finding the real story of who Prince Philip was as significant as the official version, is a good moment to subscribe if you have not already done so. We cover the private histories of the British royal family and the lives of the people around them, the stories that did not make the official press releases. There is much more coming. Subscribe now and leave a comment below telling us which person in Philip's life you find most surprising. All the women whose lives intersected with Philip's, his mother is the one whose story sits most uncomfortably inside the official account. Princess Alice of Battenberg was in almost every dimension an extraordinary person. She was born deaf at Windsor Castle in 1885, into a family that included Kaiser Wilhelm II among its relatives, and that expected its women to be decorative and compliant. She declined to be either. She learned to lip read in 4 languages. She married a Greek prince, raised 5 children, survived exile, survived institutionalization, survived Nazi occupation, and founded a religious order, all while wearing, for the second half of her life, grey floor-length habit of a Greek Orthodox nun that she had made for herself after her recovery from the sanatorium, and which she would wear to daughter-in-law's coronation in 1953. At the coronation, she sat in the royal box behind the Queen Mother. She was a woman in her late 60s in a nun's habit, surrounded by peers and princes in their formal robes. She attracted considerable press attention, and she appeared not to care at all. This was characteristic. Her relationship with Philip, across the arc of their shared life, was the relationship that formed him most deeply, and that cost him most when it was taken from him. He had been 9 years old when she was committed to the sanatorium in Kreuzlingen. He had received no visits from her during the years he was at Cheam. His letters to her, if he wrote them, apparently not received or not answered in any way he was later able to describe. She was, for the years of his early adolescence, simply not there, not dead, not gone in the clean sense that death provides, present somewhere in Switzerland in an institution, undergoing treatments that included, by Freud's recommendation, X-rays directed at her ovaries, and that had produced a woman whom Philip finally saw her again at Cecile's funeral in 1937. He described in later years only as thin and exhausted. Gap between his 9th and 16th birthdays, which were the years he should have been able to rely on her, attained almost no contact with her at all. This was not her choice. She had protested her institutionalization. She had asked to see her children and been denied. She had begged to be allowed to attend Margarita's wedding in 1931, while she was still at Kreuzlingen, and the request had been refused. She had been a prisoner in the most precise meaning of the word, a medical institution that her own family had chosen to put her in. None of this reached Philip in any form he could process as a child. Reached him was the absence, and the absence, regardless of its cause, was absolute. He had also watched his mother do something. He was old enough to understand what she was doing, that had no precedent in his experience of adults. During the German occupation of Athens in the Second World War, Princess Alice had remained in the city and had worked with the Greek Red Cross, organizing soup kitchens for orphan children. She had no money, she had no protection beyond her title and the grey habit and the very particular authority of a woman who had suffered enough that she had stopped being frightened of anything. In 1943, a Jewish widow named Rachel Cohen came to her. The Germans were rounding up the Jewish population of Greece with exceptional brutality. 87% of the country's 80,000 Jewish citizens would be killed in the Holocaust. Rachel Cohen needed somewhere to hide herself and 2 of her children. Princess Alice hid them in her apartment in Athens for more than a year. Gestapo officers came to question her about the occupants of her apartment. She told them she could not understand what they were saying. Deafness was in this moment her weapon. She had spent her whole life reading lips in 4 languages, and she chose now not to read them. Gestapo officers, confronted with a deaf elderly woman in a nun's habit who showed no sign of comprehension, eventually left. Cohen family survived the occupation. In 1994, Israel recognized Princess Alice as righteous among the nations, designation given by Yad Vashem to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jewish people during the Holocaust. Her remains were moved from Windsor to Jerusalem in 1988, fulfilling the dying wish she had expressed, but that had not been honored when she died in 1969. She is buried at the Church of Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives, next to her aunt, Grand Duchess Elizabeth of Russia. Philip, being invited to the ceremony at which his mother was honored, could not attend. He sent a statement. It read, "I knew that my mother had sheltered this family, but I had no idea it was of such significance." He had known about it for 40 years. The statement was true and also somehow insufficient. He had known and had not spoken about it. The recognition came 25 years after her death, and the statement he sent was the careful, constrained statement of a man who had spent 70 years communicating in institutional language about personal matters. Alice had come to live at Buckingham Palace in 1967, 2 years before she died. She was 82 and unwell, and Philip had arranged the move. She had not lived in England with any regularity since the early 1920s, but she had come now, in the last years of her life, to the house where her son and his wife lived, and she lived there in the rooms allocated to her, wearing her grey habit, continuing the letters and correspondence of her small religious order, and appearing at family meals with the contained dignity of a woman who had, through too much to be impressed by anything further. Philip visited her regularly. His grandchildren visited her. Charles would later remember her as strict and exacting, not warm in the obvious sense, but present in a way that mattered. She died on December 5, 1969, at the age of 84, in the same building where her son worked and slept. Philip did not speak in public about her death for years. When he did, he described her as a woman of great spiritual strength who had faced her own suffering without complaint. He said she had an inner serenity that he had always admired. The phrase "in inner serenity" is doing considerable work in a sentence about a woman who, been forcibly committed to a sanatorium by her own family, had been separated from her children for years against her will, been abandoned by her husband, had survived Nazi occupation alone, and had spent the last decades of her life in a grey habit building a religious order in a country that had not treated her particularly well. The inner serenity was real and visible to people who met her. Cost of that serenity, what it had taken for Alice to arrive at it, was something Philip understood better than most people and was not equipped to discuss. His mother had been the first woman whose absence had taught him something important about the risks of needing people. Lesson had been delivered at 9 years old, before he had the resources to evaluate it. It had lodged in the center of his personality, with the permanence of something learned at exactly the moment when personality is forming. He loved her. He had always loved her. He had also, across decades of not quite contact, built around himself the same protective mechanism that her own institutionalization had forced him to build. Mechanism that kept the thing underneath from being available to be hurt. The mechanism worked. He could be in a room with her for years and never let her know, and she could be in a room with him for years and understand it. Between them, they could maintain the form of a relationship, while the substance of what they needed from each other remained unexpressed. This was how he would relate to the women who mattered to him for the rest of his life. Not all of them. Not the women from the Thursday Club or the polo circuit who were a different kind of connection and asked for a different kind of engagement. The women who came close. The women who might have had access to the thing underneath. Those women learned what Princess Alice had learned. He could be warm and could be present and could care with a sincerity that was not in doubt, and he could also, the moment when the warmth required the next step, when it required exposure, withdraw to a place that could not be reached. Susan Barrantes arrived in Philip's orbit through the polo world. Her father was a wealthy farmer, and she had been presented at court in 1954, during the debutante season, which in the social structure of that period was still the mechanism by which a certain kind of young woman was formally introduced to a certain kind of world. She had married in January 1956 a man named Ronald Ferguson, played polo for the Guards, and who would eventually become the polo manager for Charles, Prince of Wales. He would later write a memoir, Galloping Major, My Life and Singular Times, in which he described a particular quality of Philip's social behavior at polo matches and at the country house gatherings that surrounded them. Prince Philip, Ron Ferguson wrote, usually made a beeline for the prettiest girl on the dance floor. He certainly found Susie's company much more enticing than mine. The memoir was Ron Ferguson's own work, written without apparent bitterness, in the register of a man who had spent enough years in royal circles to regard this kind of thing as a fact of life rather than an insult. He had watched Philip move through social events with the particular attention of a man who knew how to identify the person in any room who interested him most, and he had watched this attention directed at his wife. He had written about it in a published book 9 years before his own death in 2003. Susan Barrantes divorced Ron Ferguson in 1974. She married an Argentine polo player, Hector Barrantes, and moved to Argentina, where she spent most of the rest of her life. Their daughter Sarah, born in 1959, grew up mostly in England with her father and his second family. Sarah Ferguson would eventually become, in 1986, the Duchess of York, wife of Philip's son Andrew. The proximity is not lost in the family's internal accounting. Philip would have known Susan through polo throughout the 1960s. The polo world in that period was a relatively small social circuit. The same people, same events, the same country houses, the same August weekends at Cowdray Park or Smith's Lawn at Windsor. Susan Barrantes was part of that circuit. Ron Ferguson's account suggests the nature of Philip's attention to her was specific and was noticed. The relationship between Philip and Susan Barrantes actually has never been established through documentation. Her name appears in the biographies with the same qualified certainty that attaches to the other names, which is to say that it appears as a rumor that cannot be confirmed and cannot be entirely dismissed, substantiated primarily by the testimony of the man she was married to, who wrote about it with the casualness of someone recording an established social fact. Susan Barrantes died on January 19, 1998, when her car was hit by a lorry near the family's estancia in Argentina. She was 61 years old. Her daughter, the Duchess of York, flew to Argentina immediately. Sarah Ferguson's relationship with Philip has never been characterized as warm, which is a significant understatement by anyone who has read the palace accounts from the 1990s. Texture of that relationship involves dynamics well beyond any question of Susan's association with Philip. Proximity of Sarah's family to Philip's world, beginning with polo and with her parents' marriage, and with all that attached to it. Part of the background that the Ferguson-Windsor marriage was set against. Same country house world that Susan Barrantes occupied in the 1960s, was another woman whose name would become attached to Philip's in a form slightly more documented and slightly more specific. Sacha Abercorn, born Alexandra Anastasia Phillips in 1946 in Tucson, Arizona, where her father had been recovering from tuberculosis, had a background as complicated in its way as Philip's own. Her father, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Phillips, known to everyone as Bunny, one of the more socially connected figures of his generation, a man with an interesting war record, a gift for friendship, and a family history that touched the Wernher and Mountbatten worlds at multiple points. Her mother, Georgina Wernher, the daughter of Sir Harold Wernher, a man whose fortune and social position placed him at the center of the kind of world where you might plausibly have known Philip's Uncle Dickie. The family connection was genuine and old. Sacha herself had a claim to Russian descent through her maternal grandmother, Anastasia de Torby, who was a morganatic daughter of Grand Duke Michael Mikhailovich of Russia, and who was herself a descendant, through a long and complicated genealogical chain, of the poet Alexander Pushkin. Sacha would later found the Pushkin Trust and the Pushkin Prizes in Northern Ireland, supporting creative writing programs for young people. She would cite this descent as one of her motivations. She had married at Westminster Abbey in October 1966 James Hamilton, Marquess of Hamilton, who would become in 1979 the 5th Duke of Abercorn. The Queen and Philip attended the wedding. Queen Mother was there because Sacha's mother-in-law was her mistress of the robes. Prince Andrew, aged 6, was a page. Hamilton family seat was Baronscourt, near Newtownstewart in County Tyrone in Northern Ireland. Sacha Abercorn died on December 10, 2018, aged 72, following an illness. Royal Central's tribute described her as a close friend of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who often came carriage driving at Baronscourt. The phrase offered in an obituary, close to a formal statement of the relationship as any public source provides. Philip drove carriages at her estate in Northern Ireland. Came regularly enough that it was notable and worth recording. He continued these visits across the years in which carriage driving had become his competitive sport after his retirement from polo in 1971. What was said between them during those visits at Barrantes on the long drives through the County Tyrone countryside that carriage driving requires is not part of any record. What is on the record is that Philip came and continued to come, and that Sacha was the hostess. The relationship was long and apparently comfortable, and that it ended only when she died, 7 years before him. Carriage driving is not a sport that rewards the performance of ease. You are seated in an open vehicle. You are controlling 2, 4, sometimes 6 horses through combinations of rein and voice, and the almost telepathic communication that develops between a good driver and a team knows them. The horses feel anxiety in your hands. They feel uncertainty in your hesitation. Respond to the person holding the reins with a sensitivity that no court protocol or diplomatic etiquette can replicate, which means that carriage driving is one of the few activities in which what you feel cannot be hidden behind what you present. Philip took up competitive carriage driving in the early 1970s after he retired from polo at 50. Threw himself into it with the same intensity he had brought to polo, to cricket at Gordonstown, to naval service, every physical activity he had ever pursued. He helped develop the international rules for the sport, working with the Fédération Équestre Internationale. He competed at serious international events into his late 50s and early 60s, driving 4-in-hand teams around obstacle courses that demanded precision and nerve. Carriage driving world was also where Penny Knatchbull became, over a period of years, the person who sat in the seat beside him. Born Penelope Eastwood in 1953, exactly 1 month before the coronation of the Queen, who was the woman she would eventually spend more time with than perhaps any other person outside her own family. Her father, Reginald Eastwood, founded the Angus Steakhouse restaurant chain. The family was comfortable without being grand, meant Penny arrived in the world that her marriage would bring her into, from a position of relative simplicity. She never entirely lost the capacity for practical ordinary life that this origin provided. She met Philip and the Queen for the first time around 1974. She was 21 years old. The connection came through the Mountbatten family, specifically through Norton Knatchbull, who was the grandson of Philip's uncle Dickie, Lord Mountbatten. Norton had grown up in the outer orbit of the royal family, had known Philip and the Queen since childhood, and was, by the time Penny met him, young man in his late 20s with the easy familiarity that comes from having spent your life around extraordinary people without being extraordinary yourself in any publicly visible sense. Penny married Norton on October 20, 1979. Prince Charles was his best man at the wedding. Ceremony made Penny, almost immediately, part of a network of relationships that included the Queen, Philip, Charles, entire senior layer of the royal household. She was not a courtier, she was not staff, she was family at one remove, connected by marriage to the man Philip called his godson, and by proximity to a world she had not grown up in. She learned it with a combination of observational intelligence and practical adaptability that Philip, who had very little patience for people who struggled with directness, apparently found genuinely refreshing. 5 months before Penny and Norton's wedding, Lord Mountbatten had been killed. On August 27, 1979, a Monday, Mountbatten had gone out on his fishing boat from the harbour at Mullaghmore in County Sligo, on the west coast of Ireland. He went out regularly from his summer home at Windsor Castle, a Victorian pile on the Mullaghmore Peninsula that looked out at the Atlantic and had been in the family for decades. The boat was called Shadow V. There were several people aboard, including family members. Shortly after the boat left the harbour, a bomb planted in the hull by the Provisional IRA detonated. Mountbatten was killed instantly. He's 79 years old. 3 others died in the explosion, including his 14-year-old grandson, Nicholas Knatchbull, who was Norton's younger brother. Norton Knatchbull lost his grandfather and his brother in the same afternoon. Philip lost the man who had been the most important adult in his life since George Milford Haven died when Philip was 17. The grief was shared. Sharing of it made a particular kind of bond between the people who had been closest to Mountbatten. Philip and the Knatchbulls were among those people. Penny, who had been married to Norton for only weeks, found herself in the middle of a family catastrophe whose scale and violence was unlike anything in her experience. She handled it with the same quality that Philip would come to value in her across the years. She did not break down, did not demand attention for her own distress. She managed and she stayed present and she helped. Philip noticed. He noticed because it was the behavior he most respected, and the behavior he least expected from someone who was, by any standard, young and newly arrived in this world, and had no particular obligation to cope as well as she did. Their friendship built slowly. Background of ordinary family life. Dinners at Broadlands, the Mountbatten house in Hampshire, that Norton inherited from his grandfather. Inns in the country. The gradual accumulation of small moments. A walk after dinner. Conversation at the edge of a social gathering where both of them had grown bored with the performance of being at a social gathering. Particular ease that develops between two people when they have spent enough time in the same room to stop needing to impress each other. Philip did not collect friends easily. He had very few people outside the formal structures of palace life who had genuine rather than transactional access to him. The number of people he could sit with at the end of an evening and say exactly what he thought without calculating the consequences. First was, by every account of the people who actually knew him, very small. Penny became one of them. The carriage driving was part of it. Gave them a context that was neither social performance nor official function. Shared technical interest in which rank was irrelevant. What mattered was whether you knew how to handle a nervous horse in a wet field. Philip encouraged Penny to take it up competitively, and she did. He also introduced Sophie, his son Edward's wife, to the sport. Lady Louise Windsor later competed in it as well. But with Penny the interest ran deeper than sport, provided the occasion for a kind of regular company that their respective positions made difficult to explain in any other terms. In June 1986, Penny gave birth to her third child, a daughter they named Leonora. Princess Diana was Leonora's godmother. His four sisters, who were not invited to his wedding, who were present at his father's funeral when Philip was 17, but who had by that point been German for 18 years in every way that mattered, represent a dimension of Philip's early life that his biographers have sometimes found difficult to fully integrate into the public story. Margarita had married Gottfried, Prince of Hohenlohe-Langenburg. Theodora had married Berthold, Margrave of Baden. Seal, who died in the 1937 plane crash, had been married to Georg Donatus, hereditary Grand Duke of Hesse. Sophie had married Prince Christoph of Hesse, who had been a member of the Enstub and a colonel in the SS. Political affiliations of these families in the early 1930s were, in the context of what the Nazi government was doing in Germany, merely embarrassing for the British royal family's post-war image, but genuinely uncomfortable for Philip himself. Brother-in-law Christoph had died in 1943 in a plane crash while on active service for the Luftwaffe. Funeral photograph from Cecile's 1937 service, with Philip walking in school uniform between columns of men in Nazi uniform. The image that kept reappearing in biographies, with the footnote that it made everyone involved uncomfortable. Philip's response to the German question, to the specific question of what his sisters' families had done, and what his own presence at those funerals, those family gatherings had meant, was the same response he applied to every dimension of his early life that did not have a clean resolution, did not discuss it, he did not offer an explanation. He produced, when it was required, a statement that acknowledged that 3 of his brothers-in-law had been members of or associated with the Nazi Party. This was a fact of the history of his family in that period, and that it was not a fact he was able to change, and was not a fact that required him to feel differently about his sisters. His sisters were his sisters. They had been, in the years before the family collapsed, closest available relatives in a family that had no close relatives in the operational sense that matters to a child. Seal had been the one he was closest to, and her death in 1937 had been the loss that, Philip's own account, in the rare moments when he discussed the hierarchy of his losses, he described as the worst. Not his mother's institutionalization, not his father's departure for Monte Carlo, but his sister's death in a Belgian fog on the way to a wedding. Other 3 sisters survived the war, navigated the complicated process of post-war reconciliation, maintained their relationship with Philip across the years of his marriage and his public life. Margarita died in 1981. Theodora died in 1969, same year as their mother. Sophie died in 2001. Philip attended their funerals as he had attended Cecile's. Relationship he maintained with them, at the careful distance imposed by his position and their German histories and the institutional requirements of the British monarchy, was one of the dimensions of his private life that the biographies have generally acknowledged without fully examining. He had survived by not needing them, in the way he had survived his mother's institutionalization and his father's departure, and every other loss of the early years. but they were there across his life, as the people who had been present at the beginning, for the performance had formed, and their presence was its own kind of continuity, even at considerable distance. His relationship with his children requires careful attention, because it connects directly to the most important question about him, which is the question of what happens to a person when the losses of early life are processed entirely into competence and not at all into feeling. Philip had 4 children. Anne, born in 1950, who is by every account the most like him of the 4 in temperament, direct, hard-working, missive of sentiment, excellent in practical crisis. Andrew, born in 1960, who is like him in some of the worst ways and none of the best ones. Edward, born in 1964, who is the subject of a separate and complicated set of questions about paternity that the palace preferred not to examine and the family treated with studied disinterest. And Charles, born in 1948, who is the one this section is mostly about, because Charles is where the damage that Philip absorbed in childhood got passed along most legibly. Philip applied to Charles the philosophy of education he had learned from Kurt Hahn, Gordonstoun for the school. Physical hardship as the mechanism of character formation, emotional self-sufficiency as the goal, expectation that the difficulties of life were to be absorbed without complaint, processed without display, managed without seeking support. It had worked on Philip because Philip had needed it. Philip had been a child already stripped of most of the consolations of normal family life when he arrived at Gordonstoun. The school's philosophy of self-sufficiency was not an imposition on him. It was a framework that confirmed and organized what he had already been forced to develop. Gordonstoun did not damage Philip, gave a name and a structure to the coping mechanism he had already built. Charles was not Philip. Charles had not spent his childhood in the condition of loss and displacement that made Gordonstoun's philosophy a relief rather than an ordeal. Charles had a mother who was present and a father who was present, and a stable if unusual home, and every material provision that a royal childhood provides. What Charles lacked, in the specific way that matters, was the emotional vocabulary to process what he experienced, language with which to name what he felt, and communicate it to the people around him who might have been able to respond. Philip could not provide this vocabulary because he did not have it himself. What Philip could provide was what Gordonstoun had provided him. Clear model of how to manage, run in the rain, take the cold shower, show up and do the work, and do not ask for comfort because comfort is not available and in any case should not be necessary. These were the instructions that Philip's own childhood had handed him. They were the instructions he handed to his son, and they were the wrong instructions for the specific child he was handing them to. Philip knew, in later life, that this had been a failure. He did not often say so in the direct language that the acknowledgement would have required. He did was something characteristically his. He said it by implication, through the slight but visible modification in how he spoke about Charles in his later years, through the occasional concession in conversation that his own expectations had not always been calibrated to the person in front of him. He had also, the Diana years were at their most destructive in the late 1980s and early 1990s, been required to watch the consequences of what the unexamined transmission of his own damage had produced. Charles was a man who was genuinely sensitive, genuinely artistic, genuinely kind in ways that Philip's model of masculinity had no particular respect for, who had been formed by a childhood that told him these qualities were weaknesses, carried the resulting self-division into adulthood, and into a marriage that had been organized by an institution rather than by the people in, and who was now being photographed in profile, looking miserable at official functions, while his wife sat beside him looking equally miserable. British press sold millions of copies of every image. Philip watched this. He understood more of it than he said. He did not have the language to say most of what he understood, and saying it would have required acknowledging things about himself that his own management of his own losses had made permanently difficult. But he watched, and the watching produced the accounts of people who were close to him in those years, a form of grief that was not expressed as grief, and was not acknowledged as grief, but present in the way he moved through that period, a slight but real heaviness in a man who had spent his entire life refusing heaviness. His relationship with his grandchildren was by most accounts warmer than his relationship with his children had been. Distance that the structure of his position and his own emotional limitations had imposed between him and Charles and Anne and Andrew and Edward, not absent with the grandchildren, but it was differently shaped, because his grandchildren did not require from him what his children had. required. He was not responsible for them in the same way. He could be present with them in the mode that he actually had available. Was the mode of the person who shows up, is funny, asks real questions, and does not stay long enough for the difficult emotional work to become necessary. William and Harry grew up in the shadow of their parents' catastrophic marriage, and then in the different shadow of their mother's death, remembered their grandfather with genuine warmth. William in particular cited Philip's sense of humor and his refusal to treat his grandchildren as symbols rather than people as things he valued. The irony that Philip had often treated his children more as symbols than as people, had not applied the same quality of attention to Charles that he later applied to Charles's sons, kind of irony that Philip was fully capable of recognizing, and that he probably preferred, in the way of his nature, to examine too closely. The woman who spent the most time with Philip, across the longest span of years, was his wife, and what Elizabeth endured, accommodated, and absorbed in that marriage is the central context, without which none of the other women's stories make complete sense. Married in November 1947, at Westminster Abbey, on a grey London day when rationing was still in effect and the city still carried its wartime damage and the country was exhausted in the deep way of nations that have spent years surviving rather than living. Wedding had nonetheless drawn enormous crowds and generated a tide of public affection that the palace was not expecting to be quite so large and quite so genuine. Britain wanted a wedding. It needed the occasion to feel like the beginning of something, and Elizabeth and Philip gave it that. Philip, who had given up his Greek and Danish royal titles, taken British citizenship, changed his family name from Mountbatten Glucksburg to Mountbatten, had been processed into the British royal machine, with the thoroughness that institution applied to everything it absorbed. He was 26 years old. He had spent the previous several years at sea during a war, developing a naval identity that was the first identity he had built for himself that was entirely his own, earned through competence and character rather than inherited through birth. The Navy had suited him perfectly. It valued practical intelligence, physical courage, directness, and the ability to make decisions under pressure, without wasting time on the feelings of people whose feelings were not operational priority. He had been good at it, he had been promoted, he had a clear and achievable future in it. The marriage ended that career. Terms of marrying the heir presumptive to the British throne required him to be a consort. Word with no clear institutional definition and no real power, and no precedent for what a consort actually did in the 20th century. Albert of Saxe-Coburg had done it in the 19th century with Queen Victoria. Template he had used required a level of deference and personal subordination to the regnant spouse that Philip, being raised in Gordonstoun's philosophy of self-reliant male stoicism, was temperamentally unsuited to perform. He managed the transition with considerable effort and with occasional visible difficulty. The effort was real. Threw himself into the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, which he had developed with Kurt Hahn as a national version of Gordonstoun's philosophy, which would eventually reach several million young people across 65 countries, and provide him with the clearest evidence that his contribution to public life had been worth something. He threw himself into conservation work, threw himself into dozens of organizations and causes with the particular energy of a man who was doing 10 things at once, partly because doing 10 things at once left very little time for the quieter and more difficult work of feeling what he felt. Marriage operated in the way that very long marriages inside very unusual institutions operate, is to say that it contained, within its 73 years, multiple different marriages, some of them easier than others, none of them fully visible to the people watching from outside. The Malta years, from 1949 to 1951, Philip was stationed there as a naval officer, and Elizabeth had come to be with him, and they had lived something as close to an ordinary life as ever lived, were, by the accounts of both of them, the happiest period. They had a rented house, dined at other people's tables and had people to dinner at theirs. Elizabeth drove herself around the island and shopped in the markets and was, for a period, more wife than princess. Philip could be, for a period, more husband than duke. Period ended when George VI's health deteriorated and Elizabeth was required back in England, and the structure of their life inside the institution reasserted itself permanently. After Malta, the marriage operated in the register that it would maintain for the next 60 years. Public, careful, managed by the institutional machinery that surrounded both of them, and are private in ways that the people watching could not see. staff inside the household saw was what Elizabeth's most trusted biographers have documented, carefully, with appropriate qualification, because the people who saw it and were willing to speak about it understood that they were speaking about the marriage of two people who could not be questioned and who had never either of them authorized anyone to speak about it. Philip was difficult in the marriage in ways that were specific and consistent. He interrupted her, he corrected her, often in public, often in front of staff, with a directness that the staff found either impressive or appalling, depending on their own sense of what a husband was permitted to do in the early 21st century. He said with regularity that made it almost habitual, "Don't talk such rubbish." Directed at his wife, or you're completely wrong. Directed at his wife, in the middle of conversations about anything from state policy to household arrangements to the color of a uniform. One former member of staff recalled years afterward that the phrases functioned like verbal tics, automatic corrections that he reached for when something she had said had failed to meet a standard he had set but never quite articulated. Queen's management of this behavior was the management of a woman who had decided very early and very deliberately confrontation with Philip on the ordinary occasions of his temper would cost more than it would produce. Confrontation with Philip produced escalation. Escalation created visible domestic instability in a household that was watched by hundreds of people. Professional lives depended on the stability of the institution it contained. She had calculated the costs and had chosen to absorb the behavior rather than challenge it. Is a choice that looks passive from the outside and is in fact a choice that requires considerable and sustained discipline to execute. She absorbed it by doing nothing, not by suppressing a reaction that was visible and then suppressed, by apparently not having the reaction in the first place, or by having it somewhere internal that produced no external signal. Staff watched her receive a dismissal or a contradiction and watched her face and found nothing. She redirected the conversation in the direction Philip had pushed it. She continued being precisely herself. The staff, taking their cue from her, also found nothing. They were not performing impassivity. They had been trained into it by example. Most efficient training method available when the behavior being trained cannot be named or acknowledged. The rare occasions when Elizabeth's management failed, the failure was precise and brief. There is an account of an occasion on the Royal Yacht Britannia when she withdrew to her cabin and announced, in a voice that the corridor could hear, she would not be coming out until her husband was in a better temper. The phrasing was notable, not until they had reached an agreement, until the argument was resolved, until he was in a better temper. The framing located the problem in him, which was accurate, proposed as the solution, not her accommodation of his behavior but his management of it. She understood exactly what she was dealing with. She had understood it for decades. Philip understood what she was dealing with too. He was not a stupid man. He knew that his behavior was difficult. He knew that his management of his own frustrations was imperfect. He had told more than one person across the years that he was not easy to live, which was a considerable understatement, delivered with the self-awareness of a man who had spent a great deal of time in rooms where nobody was permitted to say so directly. He had also, by the accounts of the people who knew them both, loved her, genuinely, durably, in a way that coexisted with all the difficulty, and that was visible in exactly the moments when the performance was dropped. The occasions when something caught them both unaware and produced a shared reaction that neither had prepared. Quality of attention between them was obvious and unmistakable. The love was real. The damage was also real. Things were true for 73 years. The palace's protection of Philip extended across the 70 years of his public life, through mechanisms so well established and so routinely applied that the people operating them had, by the middle decades of the century, ceased to think of them as protection and had begun to think of them simply as how things were. Gentlemen's agreement between the British press and the palace, which governed the reporting of the royal family through most of the 20th century, was not a written agreement. It did not have signatories or formal provisions. It was an understanding obtained through the shared interest of both parties. The press continued to receive access, photographs, official statements, the various forms of palace cooperation that made royal coverage commercially viable. The palace continued to receive the protection of stories that would have been commercially lucrative for the press to tell, but that the press declined to tell because telling them would have ended the arrangement. This understanding had been built over decades into the professional culture of the royal correspondents and editors who maintained it. They understood that certain things were not written because they lacked evidence, not because the stories were untrue, but because the stories were outside the terms of the arrangement and writing would have consequences that the people involved preferred to avoid. Philip benefited from this arrangement in ways that were specific and considerable. Thursday club evenings were not reported in the British press through a decade of their operation. Women whose names circulated in London social conversation in the 1950s and 1960s were not named in British newspapers, even as the conversation about them was widespread enough that the American press, which operated under no such agreement, comfortable reporting the London gossip in general terms. The Britannia tour produced a scandal that the American press reported directly. British press reported only by implication. When the arrangement finally began to break down, in the 1980s, the arrival of a generation of editors who did not feel bound by conventions they had not themselves signed and who were operating in a media environment that included the tabloid press operating outside the traditional boundaries. Protection that Philip had relied on began to be less reliable. But by 1985 he was 64 years old. Public's interest in whatever he might have been doing privately in his 50s was considerably less acute than its interest in the marriages of his children, which were, by the late 1980s, providing the press with all the material it could reasonably desire. Queen's protection of Philip was different in kind from the palace's institutional protection. The institution protected him through silence, through the management of access, through the strategic deployment of press relationships. Elizabeth protected him through something more personal and more costly. She absorbed the consequences of his behavior in their shared life with a consistency that required her to maintain, year after year, discipline of not having a visible reaction to things that she was certainly reacting to internally. She had done this since the early years of the marriage. She had done it in Malta. Terms of the arrangement between them were first being worked out. She had done it through the Thursday Club years. She had done it through the Britannia crisis of 1957 and the unauthorized denial that the palace had issued in her name. She had done it, staff accounts, through decades of being publicly corrected by her husband in front of her staff, a particular form of the don't talk such rubbish intervention that appears in the record with a frequency that suggests it was not an aberration, pattern. She had done it through decades of watching him give his specific and genuine attention to women who provided him with what the institution prevented him from having, and she had not, in any of the accounts available, ever extracted a confession or forced a confrontation or produced a rupture. The discipline this required was by any standard formidable. Also in the specific context of the marriage, a form of love, not a passive form that required nothing of her or that she produced without cost. The active, sustained disciplined choice to absorb rather than confront, to maintain rather than expose, to keep the institution functioning rather than demand that the institution accommodate her own very considerable personal needs, was a choice she made again and again across 70 years. Whether it was the right choice, whether the marriage would have been better and the institution would have survived better if Elizabeth had been more demanding and less absorptive, a question that has no answer. The choice was made and remade across decades. The marriage was what it was. Philip was what he was. Elizabeth was what she was. The institution that they both served with a completeness that made personal happiness secondary to institutional continuity survived, and it survived because of the discipline both of them brought to its maintenance. Philip knew this. He said it at his silver wedding anniversary in 1972. A marriage requires tolerance in abundance. He was giving his wife credit for the tolerance. He was also, in the same sentence, acknowledging that the tolerance had been required, which is a form of acknowledgement that is not the same as an apology but is something. Leonora Knatchbull was born healthy and lively, and every account of the family members who knew her in her early years absolutely certain of her own importance in the world, is the particular confidence of the youngest child in a family where she is thoroughly loved. She grew up at Broadlands alongside the organized chaos of a household that sat at the edge of the royal family's social world, attended family gatherings at Windsor and Balmoral, was held and played with by people who had also held and played with her father when he was her age. Princess Diana, who had a quality of emotional attentiveness that the royal household found both compelling and inconvenient, was her godmother. Philip, who liked children with the pragmatic appreciation of someone who understood they did not require performance, met her when she was small and had formed, in the way he formed, attachments to things that did not demand explanation, kind of affectionate recognition that she was part of the world that had come to matter to him. In the summer of 1990, the extended family gathered for a holiday in Majorca. It was the kind of gathering that was meant to provide the simple relief of sun and sea and temporary distance from the particular pressures of each person's ordinary life. Charles and Diana were there with William and Harry, both young enough to be mostly sheltered from the ugliness that was accumulating around their parents' marriage. Norton and Penny were there with their children. For a week or so, it was intended to look like what ordinary wealthy families do in the summer. Leonora was 4 years old. She was not well. What first appeared to be normal childhood illness, the kind that parents note and watch without alarm, did not resolve. Her color was wrong. Her energy was not returning. Penny, who watched her daughter with the particular attention of a mother who has already known loss, understood within days that something was wrong in a way that a virus does not explain. They took Leonora to doctors in Spain. The diagnosis was of a malignant tumor in her kidney. Wilms's tumor is a cancer that affects children almost exclusively. Treatable in many cases, but it is a cancer, and the word, when it arrived in a consulting room in Spain, did exactly what the word always does. Penny went still when she heard it. Norton went pale. Diana, who was present when the diagnosis was confirmed, said to have responded with the instinctive maternal horror of a woman who had small children the same age. Charles' own marriage was in a state of private collapse that the family had been managing around for years. Understood immediately that this was a crisis that required everything else to be set aside. A royal plane was arranged. Family returned to England. The treatment began. Leonora underwent surgery, and then the long and brutal course of treatment that childhood cancer requires. She was 4, then 5, through the months of the treatment. She lost her hair. She spent periods in the hospital. She continued spaces between the hospital stays to be recognizably herself, determined and imperious and certain of her place in the world. It is sometimes how children with serious illness manage the difficulty of their situation. Philip came, not as a formal visitor, not as a member of the senior royal family conducting an official welfare check, as someone who turned up and sat with the family and made himself useful in whatever way was available. He had learned, across a life that had included more than its share of sudden loss, that the most important thing you can do for people in the middle of catastrophe is to remain present without requiring anything of them. He had watched his own family scatter and disappear when it broke. He had been the child left in the silence after the catastrophe. He knew what presence meant when everything else had gone. Leonora died in October 1991. She was 5 years old. The grief that followed was of the kind that cannot be managed in the way that grief is usually. Death of a child at 5 years old is a specific category of loss that sits outside the usual structures of human processing. Parents who lose children this young report, years and decades later, that they never entirely finished grieving. The child's absence accumulates rather than diminishes across the years. Each birthday and each ordinary family occasion carries within it the shadow of the person who should have been there and was not. Penny, who had already survived the loss of her brother-in-law Nicholas Knatchbull in the IRA bombing, who had watched the Mountbatten family absorb that catastrophe, found herself now in the particular silence on the other side of Leonora's death. Norton, who had been close to his grandfather and his brother, and now had buried his daughter, carrying losses that compounded each other in ways that no ordinary framework of resilience was designed to accommodate. Philip, who understood this kind of accumulating loss from the inside, was there. Bond that formed between Philip and Penny in the months after Leonora's death was different from the easy companionship that had been building. For it was something closer, something that had been tested by the worst kind of experience and had held. Philip had supported the family through the treatment and through the death and through the months after. Penny had seen him do it without any requirement for acknowledgement or reciprocal support. Nature of his presence in those months had told her something about him that several decades of friendly acquaintance had not fully conveyed. She and Norton established in Leonora's memory the Leonora Children's Cancer Fund, which would support pediatric cancer care and eventually help fund the construction of the Leonora Children's Cancer Unit at Edinburgh's Royal Hospital for Sick Children. The charity gave the grief a direction. It also gave Philip a way to remain connected to what the family was doing, which was the way he preferred to express support. not through the vocabulary of condolence, which he found inadequate, through practical engagement with whatever was being built in the aftermath of loss. In the years after Leonora died, friendship deepened in the way that friendships deepen when they have survived something terrible together, through the mechanism of shared experience exactly, but through the recognition that the other person did not require the experience to be made terrible before they could be in the room with you. Penny would later be described in Ingrid Seward's 2020 biography. Prince Philip revealed, the second most important woman in the Duke of Edinburgh's life, a constant confidant, loyal companion and keeper of secrets. Phrase keeper of secrets was noted by the press when the biography was published. It does not require a great deal of interpretation. She was in the room with him in the conversations he chose not to have in the hearing of the palace press office. She was the person he called when he needed to say something that the institutional version of his life had no place for. Death of Leonora Knatchbull on October 3, 1991, sits at the center of the Philip Penny story in a way that is often mentioned in passing, never examined with the attention it deserves. She was 5 years old. She had been sick for approximately 14 months. From the summer of 1990, when the diagnosis of Wilms's tumor was confirmed in Spain, through the months of treatment in London, through the gradual and then rapid deterioration of the autumn of 1991, she died on a Thursday. Norton and Penny were with her. Sequence of events that preceded Leonora's death had included, as documented by the biographers who have examined the period, sustained and specific engagement from Philip that went beyond the formal expressions of concern appropriate to a member of the royal family and family of his godson. He had been present. He had come to Broadlands and to the hospital. He had sat with Penny in the particular way that some people have, and many people do not, without requirement for conversation, without the need to produce comfort in the form of words, simply present in the room, with the weight of a life behind them, and the willingness to let other person's grief be what it was without managing it. Penny, who had been managing her own grief with the controlled discipline of someone raised in a world where management of everything is the expected response to everything, found in Philip's company in those months something she had not expected to find. Company of someone who understood what it was to lose people and who did not pretend that the understanding made it better. Philip had lost his sister at 16. He had lost his uncle at 17. He had lost Mountbatten, who was as close to a father as he had had. Philip was 58. He had lost friends and colleagues, and the whole texture of the world he had grown up in. He had not processed these losses in the way that psychologists recommend. He had managed them in the way he managed everything, efficiency and without acknowledgement, but he knew what they were. And knowing what they were meant that he could be in the room with Penny's grief without requiring her to perform recovery, without suggesting that things would be better, out producing the well-intentioned but ultimately useless social responses that people offer when they have not themselves been tested by loss of specificity. After Leonora died, Philip continued to come to Broadlands. This is the understated fact in the biographies. He continued to come. Usual social calculus of proximity which diminishes after the acute crisis has passed, and the person in grief is expected to gradually return to ordinary life did not apply to his engagement with the Knatchbull family. He continued to appear, continued to be present in the way he had been present during the illness. He had decided that Penny required whatever it was that his presence provided, and he continued to provide it. Norton, who had his own grief and his own relationship with Philip as godson, watched this with the equanimity of a man who had grown up in the royal family, outer orbit, and had learned across years of that experience that the relationships the royal family formed and the forms those relationships took were not always amenable to the ordinary categorizations of jealousy and exclusion that the tabloid press preferred to apply to them. He and Penny had a marriage that had survived the loss of a child, which is a survival that most marriages do not achieve. Question of what Philip's sustained presence in Penny's life meant, as a question about his marriage and her marriage, not a question that the available evidence permits to be answered definitively. Can be said is that Penny's own grief and Philip's capacity to be present with it without flinching produced, across the months after Leonora died, a friendship that had changed in character from what it had been before. Before Leonora's illness, friendship had been the comfortable and mutually enjoyable friendship of two people who shared interests and found each other good company. After Leonora died, it was something that had been tested by the worst experience available to either of them. and that had held through the testing, had a depth because of the testing that it would not have had otherwise. Is the kind of depth that people carry with them for the rest of their lives. It does not diminish. It does not become one thread among many. It becomes the thread by which the rest are measured. Philip and Penny founded the Leonora Children's Cancer Fund in her memory, attended fundraising events for it together across the following years. The charity did substantial work. Leonora Children's Cancer Unit at the Royal Hospital for Sick Children in Edinburgh was built with funds it raised. The unit has treated hundreds of children in the years since its establishment. Philip's association with the charity was not nominal. Practically engaged with it, attending events and maintaining interest in its work with the seriousness he brought to the causes he genuinely cared about. He cared about this one because of the child who had died, and the mother who had survived the dying, and who had let him be present through it. In the years after Leonora's death, as the 1990s proceeded through the public catastrophe of the Diana-Charles separation and divorce, the death of Diana in Paris in August 1997, through the Queen Mother's death in March 2002, through the steady accumulation of institutional change and public scrutiny that the monarchy navigated across those decades, Philip and Penny continued their friendship in the background of everything else. Penny had inherited in 2005 title of Countess Mountbatten of Burma, which placed her formally within the structure of the family that had been the connective tissue of her relationship with Philip from the beginning. She had begun as the wife of Philip's godson. She had become, over 30 years, something closer to the center of his life than any title could describe. She drove to Wood Farm in the final years of his life. She sat in St. George's Chapel at his funeral in April 2021, one of 30 people at a social distance required by pandemic restrictions in black-out statement. In his final decade, Philip lived at Wood Farm, a small and deliberately modest house on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. Queen stayed principally at Windsor. The physical separation had been the subject of press speculation since at least 2010, and it became sufficiently consistent and well attested to require addressing. The palace's position was that Philip, who had retired from public duties in 2017, had simply chosen to spend his retirement at the location he preferred. Queen spent her time in the locations required by her responsibilities. This was accurate as far as it went. Farm had been Philip's preferred retreat for several decades. It was his. The Queen's houses were the institution's houses. Windsor and Sandringham and Balmoral existed in the service of a function that required their grandeur. Wood Farm required nothing except the person who lived there to want to be there. Philip had wanted to be there since the 1970s. He had begun to use it as the place where the performance could stop. He did not want staff hovering. He cooked his own breakfast at Wood Farm. Was such an anomalous behavior for a man of his generation and position that it was cited in every profile written in the years after his retirement as evidence of an eccentric self-sufficiency. He drove himself around the estate in a Range Rover. He read, he painted. He managed his correspondence with the independence of someone who had spent 70 years having other people manage it and had found the result unsatisfying. He was 95 years old when he retired from public duties in 2017, and he had not by any account become less himself. Impatient with small talk, blunt in his assessments, and entirely unwilling to pretend that age had mellowed him in ways that it had not. He was also, by every account of the people who visited him at Wood Farm in those final years, considerably warmer in private than any public occasion had ever permitted him to appear. Penny drove to Wood Farm regularly. The years of his retirement, she came to Norfolk and they spent time together. She drove. Nobody sent a car. There were no photographers waiting. Guards at the gate knew her. She would park and walk in, and Philip would put down whatever he had been reading. They would spend several hours in the company that both of them had learned across 30 years of friendship and loss and practical support to value. What did they talk about? The carriage, driving, books, because both of them read seriously and with specific taste. His family, from a remove at which the complications of Charles and Diana and the general difficulty of the younger generation could be discussed with the frank exasperation of someone who had watched it for 30 years and had opinions. Her family, Leonora, the absence that does not diminish. He trusted her with the things he did not say to the people around him at Buckingham Palace, because she was necessarily wiser or more astute than the people inside the palace walls, because she had no institutional stake in his being any particular way. She did not need him to be the Duke of Edinburgh. She had met him before she knew exactly what that meant, and she had known him long enough to know who he was underneath it. And she did not require the performance that the palace required, and that he had given it without complaint for 7 decades. He was also, in his final years, living with the accumulating physical reality of extreme old age in a way that he had not permitted himself to register publicly. His health had been managed and managed and managed, a series of hospital stays that were brief and described with the minimum of alarm, extended hospitalization in early 2021 for what the palace described as an infection and a pre-existing heart condition. Discharged from hospital in the first days of March 2021, he died on April 9. Penny drove to Windsor for the funeral. She was among the 30 people permitted to attend, the number imposed by the COVID-19 restrictions that had been reshaping every aspect of British life for the previous year. 30 people for the man who had attended thousands of official functions, who had been present at dozens of state occasions, who had received ambassadors and dignitaries and prime ministers and presidents across 7 decades of constitutional life. The image from the funeral that stayed in people's minds, ran in every newspaper and across every social media platform, was of the Queen. She sat alone on one side of the aisle in St. George's Chapel, masked, black-gloved, small and entirely self-contained in a way that required no annotation. She was 94 years old. She had been married to the man in the coffin for 73 years. The physical distance imposed by COVID-19, requirement to sit alone rather than with family, was the circumstance that produced the image. The image captured something beyond the circumstance. The woman sitting alone in that chapel had spent 7 decades sitting alone in the formal sense, the way that the position of a reigning monarch is ultimately an alone position, regardless of how many people are in the room. She had done it without making anything of the cost of that. Penny was on the other side of the chapel. She had dressed in the understated black appropriate to the occasion and the relationship. She sat where she was placed, and she did not make a scene going in, and she did not make a scene going out, and she said nothing to the press on either side of the church doors. The discretion she maintained that day was the discretion she had maintained across 30 years of a friendship that had visible enough to attract attention and private enough that its actual content remained known only to the 2 people most directly involved, and possibly to the people they had separately trusted with pieces of it. The press had spent years trying to characterize the friendship. Obvious characterization, the one that involved the word affair, had been available since the early 2000s, when their carriage-driving appearances together became sufficiently frequent and sufficiently publicized to require characterization of some kind. Neither of them had ever confirmed that characterization. Neither had definitively refused it. Space between confirmation and refusal is where the question has remained, which was exactly where Philip had placed every significant question about his private life, and which was where, in his absence, probably remain. Ingrid Seward, who had spent 30 years researching his biography, Philip had become closer to Penny when her life began to fall apart. The phrasing is precise. It was in the aftermath of catastrophe, death of Leonora, the accumulated losses of the Mountbatten family, the difficulty of Penny's own marriage. The friendship took on the quality that made it significant. Philip's capacity for showing up in catastrophe, willingness to be present in the silence after the worst thing happened, a quality that those who knew him most clearly identified as his most human one that all the bluntness and impatience and institutional distance could not conceal. He had learned it from his own experience of abandonment. He had been the child in the catastrophe with nobody showing up. He knew what it meant when someone did. He retired from public duties on August 2, 2017 at the age of 96, having conducted by the palace's official count 22,219 solo engagements since 1952. The number is itself a kind of statement. 22,000 events, tended by a man who had not chosen the role they required him to play in, who had been constitutionally excluded from the kind of practical authority that might have made the role more bearable, had navigated the particular difficulty of being simultaneously the most powerful man in Britain's most powerful household and the person with least formal power in that household, and who had done it for 65 years. He had done it well on the whole. Duke of Edinburgh's award had reached, by 2017, roughly 8 million young people in 144 countries. World Wildlife Fund, of which he had been a founding trustee in 1961, had become one of the most powerful conservation organizations on Earth. Work had been real. The commitment had been real. He had earned, even if not in the way he would have preferred to earn things, reputation for sustained and effective public service that the obituaries would give him. Retirement itself had been managed with the same efficiency he brought to everything. He announced it. He attended a few final public events. He moved to Wood Farm. He stopped appearing in the Daily Public Life and began, for the first time since 1952, to organize his days in accordance with his own preferences rather than the institutional schedule. The preferences were modest. He read. He painted, in oils and watercolors, with the same direct and unpretentious attention to the actual subject that characterized all his practical work. He drove himself around the Sandringham estate in a Land Rover, which became briefly controversial in January 2019 when he was involved in a road accident near the estate, and it emerged that he had been driving at 97 years old, vehicle with no seatbelt attached, and that a woman in the other car had been injured. He gave up driving on public roads afterward. It was presented in several newspapers as a gracious acknowledgement of the concern expressed by the public, and which was probably also, for someone of his temperament, simply the practical recognition that the conditions had changed, and the response to changed conditions was to adapt, rather than to argue. He was hospitalized in April 2018 for a hip replacement operation. He was hospitalized again in December 2019 for what the palace described as precautionary observation. He was hospitalized in February 2021 for the treatment of an infection, complicated by a pre-existing heart condition, spent 28 days in the King Edward VII Hospital, and then at St. Bartholomew's Hospital before returning to Windsor in early March. He died 5 weeks later. The final years at Wood Farm were years in which, by the accounts of the people who visited him there, he was entirely himself. The performance had stopped. There was nothing left to perform. He read books he was actually interested in, rather than books that were politically or institutionally appropriate. He cooked the food he wanted to cook. He had the conversations he wanted to have, rather than the conversations the schedule required. Penny came to Wood Farm. The Queen visited when her own schedule permitted, which was less often than either of them would have preferred, because the Queen's schedule was the institution's schedule, and the institution's schedule did not bend. Philip, who had spent 70 years subordinating his own preferences to the institution's requirements, spent his final years in the one place where the institution's requirements did not reach him directly. This was, in its quiet way, longest he had ever been genuinely free. He had been free as a child in a way, the unstructured freedom of a boy running in Paris with Hélène. That freedom had been underlain by the anxiety of a family in collapse. He had been free at Malta in a way. That freedom had been borrowed and temporary. At Wood Farm, the freedom was structural. The institution had agreed to release him. He had the arithmetic of extreme old age, nothing left to lose. He was 95, 96, 97, 98, 99. Each year, birthday was reported, the health was assessed, the longevity was marveled at. He had outlived his mother, his father, all 4 of his sisters, most of the people with whom he had shared the Thursday club evenings, most of the people he had known well in any context. He had outlived Hélène Cordet, he had outlived Baron, he had outlived Mike Parker, he had outlived Sacha Abercorn, he had outlived Susan Barrantes, he had outlived Pat Kirkwood. Pat Kirkwood had died on Christmas Day 2007. She had spent the last years of her life at the Kitwood House nursing home in Ilkley, and when she died, gold plaque from the Star dressing room at the London Palladium, engraved with her name, was on the door of her suite. Her husband was with her. Letters were in Thornton's custody. She had not received her statement. Philip lived for another 13 years after Kirkwood died. He had not provided the statement before her death. He provided nothing after it. Biographer who will eventually receive the letters has not yet been named. There is something in this final accounting, the asymmetry between how he died at 99 in his sleep in a royal castle, having lived a long life of genuine significance, how the women adjacent to his life ended theirs, that requires sitting with. Because the asymmetry was unique to Philip or to royalty or to men of his generation and position, because it was not. Because Philip was a person capable of considerable ethical clarity in the abstract, man who had spent decades working on conservation and education, and the development of young people, a man who understood consequences and accountability in the context where understanding them did not require anything personal from him, who had also, in the specific case of one woman who spent 59 years asking him to do something straightforward, declined. He knew he had declined. He had told people, through the mechanism of Thornton's account, that he knew there was nothing to be done. Calculation he had made was between the woman's need for vindication and the institution's preference for silence. He had chosen the institution. He had spent his entire adult life choosing the institution. It was the central pattern of his existence. He was, specific case, and in many others, the institution's most faithful and most consequential servant. That service cost the people nearest to him in ways he understood but could not, after decades of the same choice, bring himself to undo. Women whose names had been attached to Phillips across 5 decades of palace life had very different relationships to the rumors about them. Pat Kirkwood was angry. She had been angry about it since the early 1950s, when the rumors began to circulate, in the form in which they would persist for the rest of her life. She remained angry about it until she died on Christmas Day 2007 in a nursing home in Ilkley, Yorkshire. Having spent the previous 6 decades trying to obtain from Philip the acknowledgement she believed she was owed, she never received it. The mechanism that had protected Philip was the mechanism that had exposed her. British press of the 1950s and 1960s operated under a gentleman's agreement with the palace that prevented certain stories from running in certain ways. The agreement protected Philip directly because the stories about him could not be told fully without identifying him as the subject. Kirkwood could be identified. She had been in public with him. Their evening together at the Milroy was a matter of visible record. Rumors about her could be told and retold and circulated without requiring anyone to say anything about Philip that the palace could object to. She was the collateral damage of an arrangement that existed to protect someone else. Her 4th husband, Peter Knight, who was a musician and who had known her for most of the latter part of her career, understood this clearly and said so. He had watched her spend years trying to find a way to clear her name through channels that remained unavailable to her. Honours List was one such channel. In Britain, an honour such as a damehood from the Order of the British Empire is administered by the Prime Minister's office but is influenced by recommendations from across the institutional hierarchy, including the royal household. Knight's statement that Kirkwood had been denied the recognition her career merited because of Prince Philip was not documentary evidence of anything. It was the assessment of someone who had watched the situation for decades and had reached a conclusion that was, at minimum, consistent with everything else known about the case. The letters between Kirkwood and Philip that passed into Thornton's custody after her death, not yet been published. Philip died in April 2021. His official biographer has not yet been announced. When the appointment is made, Thornton has said he will pass the letters to that person. What they contain, confirmation of intimacy or the protracted management of a rumor, warmth or formality, or the particular calibrated distance of a man writing to a woman he wished would stop asking him for something he was not going to provide, is not known outside the circle of the 2 people who wrote them and the friend who is keeping them. Hélène Cordet had managed the question for 50 years with a precision that was itself a kind of art. She had written a memoir that addressed the subject by declining to address it, in a way that invited the reader to draw whatever conclusion they brought to the text. She had maintained, through the decades of London gossip columns, and the occasional biography that revived the question, composure of a woman who had decided that the question was not going to be answered, and that any attempt to answer it would serve no one's interests, including her own. She died in 1996, having maintained that position for 50 years, and the silence went with her. Her son Max had spent his adult life as a management professor in Barcelona, career as far from London gossip as one can get while remaining in the academic world, answered the question of his paternity with consistent and specific denial. His father, he said, was his father. The denial was not a hedge. Categorical. He died in 2011. What both Max's denial and Helene's lifetime of strategic silence shared was the quality of having been maintained under pressure for decades without flinching. This required, if the underlying reality was what the rumors suggested, very particular kind of commitment. People who are hiding something significant over 50 years of sustained public attention do occasionally break. Neither of them did. The most charitable reading of the evidence, which is also the most factually supportable reading, the relationship between Philip and Hélène, was exactly what the family said it was. Deep, genuine, rooted in shared childhood, complicated by his position and her circumstances, and important to both of them in ways that did not require anyone to be someone else's father. Susan Barrantes, who could not speak for herself because she was killed in a car accident in Argentina in 1998, had her association with Philip documented primarily by her former husband's memoir, which was a particularly odd form of evidence. Ron Ferguson wrote about it in The Register of a Man Who Was Recording a Social Observation, Not Leveling an Accusation. It is how people write about things when they have had the years to arrive at a kind of resigned acceptance of how life worked in the world they occupied. Sacha Abercorn, who died in 2018, had left behind the carriage-driving visits to Barrantes and the brief mention in her obituary. Nothing more. Nothing more was required by the purposes for which she and Philip had needed each other, which were by every available indication, purposes that fit within the ordinary definition of friendship, and that did not require supplementary annotation. Price that these women paid was not uniform. Kirkwood paid the most in the most visible and most documented way, through the 50-year damage to her professional reputation and the lifelong frustration of an injustice she could not remedy. Hélène paid the subtler price of 50 years of managing a question she was not free to answer. Susan Barrantes paid nothing in particular from Philip's association with her, except the presence of his name in the story of her life, and the slightly unfair fact that her daughter married his son, and that the subsequent difficulty of that marriage was in the tabloid accounting, somehow also part of the same story. Penny Knatchbull has not yet been required to pay a public price. She is still alive. The story of her friendship with Philip has been told in ways that range from respectful to speculative, and she has responded to none of them, which has been sufficient. The institutional world that protected Philip while he was alive has no obligation to protect her now that he is gone. Press will eventually produce whatever it is going to produce. Her silence, which is also a choice, and which is also a form of protection, has held so far. There is a quality that appears in the accounts of each of the women who knew Philip in the specific sense of knowing him rather, knowing of him, that is worth naming, precisely because it is not what the gossip columns were looking for, and not therefore what they found. He listened. This is not as simple a statement as it sounds. Philip was not by any normal assessment a man who listened. He interrupted, corrected, he redirected conversations in the direction he preferred them to go. He had a temper that operated as a form of non-listening in its most extreme form. Declaration that the other person had said something wrong or rubbish, followed by the assumption that the conversation was now over or had moved on. Staff at Buckingham Palace had spent decades learning to communicate around the fact that Philip's attention, once he had decided something, not reliably available for the thing that had been said after he decided it. But with the women who had his genuine attention, he gave his genuine attention to very few people. The listening was real and was noticed. Sacha Abercorn described it in an interview that was not widely circulated, because it was given to a publication that had no particular public profile, in words that were precise enough to have been recorded because they were unusual enough to be worth recording. She said that he had the ability to make you feel like you were the most interesting person he had ever talked to. This was not a social skill, but a genuine quality of engagement. She said it was disarming because it came from a man who did not appear to find most people interesting. The distinction she drew between a social skill and a genuine quality of engagement is the important one. A social skill is something applied, something you deploy when the situation requires it. A genuine quality of engagement means that the interest itself is real. The attention is produced by something in the person in front of you, rather than by the requirements of the occasion. Philip's attention, when it was available, was produced by the person in front of him. He noticed things, he remembered things, he returned to previous conversations and brought the things he had noted back, in ways that conveyed that he had been thinking about what you had said after the conversation had ended. For women who had spent their lives in the orbit of power, this quality was startling. Powerful men in that world were typically surrounded by people whose job was to attend to them, and the attending had become, for most of those powerful men, the ambient condition of their existence. They were listened to. They rarely listened. Philip was listened to constantly by the institutional machinery, and by the courtiers, and by the staff, and by the public at 1,000 official events, and the constant experience of being listened to had produced in him the same response it often produces in people who live inside it. Restlessness with the performance, a desire for the reverse, a particular pleasure in the company of someone who made him attend rather than be attended to. The women who gave him this were, in each case, women who did not need anything from him that required him to perform. Hélène had known him before he was anything. Princess Alice had loved him before he knew what love was. Pat Kirkwood had been a star of similar standing in her own world and had no requirement to be impressed by his. Sacha Abercorn was a duchess in her own right, whose family connections to the Mountbatten world predated her marriage and whose own life of charity, work and philanthropic development had given her an identity entirely separate from his. Susan Barrantes had a social confidence that came from a world where polo results and horse breeding were more immediately interesting than ceremonial functions. Penny had the self-possession of a woman who had survived the death of a child and come out the other side, knowing what mattered. None of them needed him to be the Duke of Edinburgh. This was the quality they shared. Each of them was in the room with a man, not a symbol, and each of them treated him accordingly. The experience of being treated as a man rather than a symbol by a woman who had no particular reason to offer him this treatment was, in the context of Philip's life, genuinely rare. Women inside the palace treated him as the Duke of Edinburgh because that was their professional relationship and their obligation. Women who came to royal events treated him as the Duke of Edinburgh because that was the context of the event and the terms of the encounter. Women who had no particular reason to treat him as anything other than a man who was also present at a gathering were the women who gave him the kind of company that his life had by the structure of its obligations systematically removed. Penny had this quality. She had it from the beginning of their acquaintance and maintained it across 30 years of deepening familiarity. She treated him with the directness of someone who had grown up in a world that had no particular reason to be deferential, and who had arrived at deference on the occasions when it was appropriate through choice rather than compulsion. When she agreed with him, she agreed specifically and said why. When she disagreed without apology. When she had seen what he needed from a conversation, the quality of attention he was seeking, rather than the conversational performance he was capable of conducting, she provided the first and declined the second. This is the thing the women knew. They knew that the man on the other side of the performance was worth knowing. Not knowing him required the willingness to be in a room where the performance was not happening. The performance was impressive. Man was more interesting. Each of them had found him more interesting. Each of them had paid, in her own way and at her own scale, whatever the price of that knowledge was. The women who knew Philip well enough to say something true about him said, remarkable consistency across the decades and across the different forms of knowing, a version of the same thing. He made you feel seen. Word charm is not quite right for what Philip had, because charm usually implies effort, and effort implies a strategy, and what Philip deployed was not strategic. He was genuinely, specifically interested in the person in front of him when he chose to be, in a way that had nothing to do with their usefulness to him or their rank or their position. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He remembered what he had been told at previous meetings and returned to it at subsequent ones. He was, in the particular sense of someone who is fully present in a conversation, rather than waiting for the conversation to produce an opportunity, person to talk to. This quality was unusual in the context of his position. People who occupy powerful or famous positions develop, almost inevitably, the tendency to manage the social situation rather than inhabit it. The person they are talking to becomes a function, obligation, a component of a schedule, rather than a person who has something to say. Philip had spent 70 years in exactly the kind of schedule-driven life that tends to produce this tendency. He had attended thousands of receptions and hundreds of state dinners and decades of royal tours where the person in front of him was always the next person in a line of people who wanted something from him, even if what they wanted was only to be able to say afterward that they had met him. Yet the people who actually spent time with him, who had real conversations, rather than receiving the formal royal attention that was available, anyone in a receiving line, described the experience in terms that suggest it was qualitatively different from what they expected. He did not perform attentiveness. He was attentive when he chose to be, in a way that had no performative component at all, which was why it felt, to the people on the receiving end of it, like something rare. Sacha Abercorn had given an interview years before her death in which she described what it was like to talk to Philip about things that mattered. She had said that he had the ability to make you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room, and that this was not a social technique but a genuine quality of attention. She had also said that he was not easy. He was blunt in a way that could sting, and that he had no interest in being diplomatically gentle when directness was available. Things were true simultaneously and produced, in her experience, a friendship that was unlike other friendships because it made no concessions, the ordinary social requirements of managed feelings. Pat Kirkwood, who spent decades not exactly praising Philip but also not condemning him, offered in her 1999 autobiography the observation that he felt trapped and rarely got a chance to be himself. Observation came from a woman who had watched him for a few hours in 1948, which is not long enough to know a person well, which may have been long enough to observe what was true. That evening at the Milroy had been, for Philip, evening of being himself in the way that his life did not usually permit. Quality of his company that night was the quality of someone who had temporarily stepped out of the role and was simply a man at a nightclub who wanted to dance, and Kirkwood had noticed it. Hélène Cordet had known the version of him that predated the role. She had known the boy in Paris before he was anything more than a displaced child living on other people's generosity, and she had maintained the connection across 6 decades of transformation. Suggests that the person she had known in the boy had still been present in the Duke, discernible to someone who knew where to look. Penny Knatchbull had known him across 30 years of adult life in the aftermath of significant losses, which is one of the most specific and most reliable ways of knowing a person. Version of Philip she had seen was the version produced by catastrophe, the man who showed up without requiring acknowledgement for showing up, sat in the silence with the family, and asked nothing from them except that they continue. Version she had seen was also the version produced by old age, the increasing simplicity of a man who had stopped needing to prove anything and found at Wood Farm the only authentic quiet of a life that had been performatively busy for 7 decades. Philip had said, various points across his long life, things about himself that were more honest than the official version of the official version. He had said, in 1992, that he was not a saint. He had said in various private contexts that were later reported by biographers, he had not always been easy to live with and that he knew it. He had said at his silver wedding anniversary in 1972, a marriage required tolerance in abundance, and that the Queen had demonstrated this quality. He had been generous in offering this compliment to her, and uncharacteristically self-aware in what it implied about the tolerance that had been acquired. He had also at one point been asked what he most admired about Elizabeth, and he had said, her patience. The word patience, coming from him in reference to her, carries within it the recognition that patience had been required, specifically and considerably and across many years, and that the requirement had been generated by him. It was not a modest statement, it was an honest one. There is a difference between those two things, and Philip understood the difference. He had spent a lifetime performing modesty in the particular form available to him, the form of walking 2 steps behind, appearing in the second carriage, of accepting that his name would not be the name that the country used when it spoke about the institution he served. He had not spent a lifetime being modest about his own assessment of his situation. His private view of his own position, expressed to the people he trusted with it, was that he had sacrificed considerably in the service of an institution that had not always known what to do with him and had not always been grateful for what he provided. He was right about this. He had sacrificed considerably. He was also in the way of people who have sacrificed considerably and wish to be acknowledged for it, not always accurate about the costs the sacrifice had imposed on the people around him. Women whose names are in this story absorbed some of those costs. Pat Kirkwood absorbed the professional cost of an evening that was his freedom, her exposure. Princess Alice absorbed the cost of a relationship with her son, in which the wounds of his early life prevented them from ever arriving at the full conversation they should have had. Penny absorbed the ordinary cost of being closely enough connected to an enormously complicated man to have understood him, which meant understanding things that could not be said, and carrying them, continuing to do so after he was gone. This is in the end what the women closest to Philip actually knew. Knew a man who was capable of warmth and incapable of the particular kind of vulnerability that warmth requires to be fully reciprocated. Knew a man who was formed by losses that he never properly processed, who had built around those losses a personality of such complete and convincing competence that most people encountered only the competence and not losses. They knew a man who was funny and sharp and sometimes genuinely cruel and capable of sitting in the worst kind of silence with someone who needed company. They knew him. The obituaries in April 2021 knew the official version. The women knew the actual one. Prince Philip died on a Friday morning. The announcement came at noon. The flag at Buckingham Palace was lowered. BBC suspended its regular programming and ran continuous coverage, which included the archive footage that had been prepared and waiting, and that showed him across 7 decades of public appearances. Young and fair-haired at his wedding in 1947, slightly older at the coronation in 1953, weathered and characteristically impatient at a parade in the 1980s, very old and very thin at his final public appearance in 2017. He attended a Royal Marines parade at Buckingham Palace and stood in the sun and looked at the people around him with the expression of a man trying to remember their names, and was largely succeeding. The obituaries were respectful and careful. They gave his naval career its due, gave the Duke of Edinburgh's award its due. They gave his marriage its due. They described him as brusque, eccentric, occasionally offensive, committed to duty, devoted to his wife, and impossible to imagine as anything other than exactly what he was. None of the obituaries named Hélène Cordet. None of them discussed what Pat Kirkwood had said about the gentleman who should have defended her honor. 1 or 2 mentioned Penny Knatchbull in the context of their shared carriage driving. 1 or 2 mentioned that she had been among the 30 people at his funeral. The official version had been holding for 73 years 30 people in St. George's Chapel. The family, reduced to 30 by the restrictions of a pandemic that had reordered every convention of collective public life. The coffin, in the royal standard, carried slowly through the chapel by the naval pallbearers, the Queen, alone on her side of the aisle, Philip's children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, the senior members of the household, people who had been with him through decades of the work that the institution required, and Penny on the other side of the chapel in black. Distance required, watching a coffin carry the person she had known for 30 years and had been closest to in his final decade. She did not speak to the press going in. She did not speak to the press going out. She has not spoken to the press since. Discretion that she maintained in life, she maintained at the funeral, and has maintained in the months and years afterward. Ingrid Seward's biography has been published. The Crown has depicted a version of their friendship. Penny has not responded to either. Is not nothing. In a world of immediate response and managed public image and the constant pressure to define the terms of your own story before someone else does, the sustained and absolute refusal to engage is itself a form of statement. She knows what the friendship was. She knows what it meant. She has decided that these things are not available to the public and has acted on that decision with a consistency that Philip, who also decided certain things were not available to the public and acted on that decision for 70 years, would have recognized. Pat Kirkwood had wanted the opposite. She had wanted the thing made public, wanted the record corrected, wanted the gentleman to do what she said gentlemen were supposed to do when a lady's honor was in question. She died without it. Letters are in Thornton's custody. The official biographer has not been named. Princess Alice was recognized by Israel 25 years after her death. Her remains went to Jerusalem in 1988. Her son had described her careful language of a man who never quite found the right language for what she meant to him, as a woman of inner serenity who had faced her suffering without complaint. Description was true and was also a way of not saying what it would have cost him to say. She had been taken from him before he knew how to survive her absence. He had spent the rest of his life managing the consequences of that without ever quite addressing the cause. Hélène Cordet died in 1996. Boisset died in 2011. Whatever they knew together and took with them. The story of what Philip was like behind closed doors is not a story with a tidy resolution. Women closest to him took their specific and irreplaceable knowledge with them, or are still holding it. The letters are still waiting. Biographer has not been named. What is possible to say, having assembled the evidence that is available, is this. Philip was a man formed by early loss into the most efficient possible management of every subsequent loss, which meant he built structures around himself that kept the losses at a controlled distance. People who came close to him encountered both the extraordinary quality of his presence when he allowed himself to be present, and the extraordinary distance he could produce when the structures reasserted themselves. The women who knew him knew this about him, each in her different way, from her different angle of approach, across her different span of years. They knew that the official version, devoted consort walking 2 steps behind for 73 years, the plain-spoken patriarch, the great love story of the 20th century, true as far as it went and covered an enormous amount of ground that it did not go near. They knew what was underneath the version. Some of them paid a price for knowing it. On that April morning at Windsor, flag came down and the BBC suspended its programming, and the country received the news. Women who had known the private version received it too. Whatever they felt in those hours, they felt privately, because that was the only way the private version had ever operated. This is where the story ends, not at a revelation, not at a confession. The same place it always ended with Philip, which is at the edge of what was visible, and a few steps beyond it, territory that belonged to him and to the people he had allowed into it, and to no one else. Thank you for watching this through to the end. Stories like this one, the hidden histories of the people who shaped the monarchy from the inside, are what this channel is built around. You found this account worthwhile? Subscribe now and share it with someone you think would be interested. Produce these documentaries every week, and there are many more of these private histories to come. Person in this story had a life that the official record barely touched. The channel is the place those lives get told. Subscribe, hit the bell. We will see you at the next one. If this documentary gave you something you did not expect, a different angle on a story you thought you knew, or a clearer picture of the man behind the image, please subscribe if you have not already. Leave a comment. Tell us which woman's account affected you most, or which part of this story you had not encountered before. Every comment helps this kind of long-form history reach the people who want it. We will continue making these documentaries as long as you watch them, and there are more stories like this one. More lives lived in the margins of the official record. More women who understood things the palace would have preferred they not understand. More of those to come.